A hotel room, an old blue suitcase, and a secret that will change the world. Welcome to NightSleepWhisper. Tonight, I leave you with a massive 50-chapter sleep story to listen to in one go. Are you ready for Sarah Miller's mysterious adventure? Turn off the lights. Free your mind. This is the story of the blue suitcase. The sun was low in the sky when Sarah Miller arrived in the city. The city was very big. There were tall buildings everywhere. Many people walked quickly on the sidewalks. Sarah felt small, but she was also very happy. She had a new job as a manager at a large company. This was her first day in her new life. She left her small village to find adventure. She carried 2 large bags. They were very heavy. She took a taxi to a street near the center of the city. The taxi stopped in front of a building. It was the Hotel Blue. It looked very old and a bit dark. The white paint on the walls was peeling. The windows were small and dusty. "Here we are," the taxi driver said. He was an older man with a grey hat. "Thank you," Sarah said. She paid the man and stepped onto the sidewalk. The air was cool. Sarah looked up at the hotel. It was 4 stories high. She entered the lobby. The room was small and smelled like old books and coffee. There was a large wooden desk in the corner. Behind the desk stood a man. He was tall and thin. He wore a dark suit and had a very small, cold smile. His eyes were sharp. "Good evening. I am Sarah Miller. I have a reservation," she said. The man looked at a large book on the desk. He did not use a computer. "Yes, Miss Miller. Room 402. Here is your key." He handed her a heavy metal key. It had a red plastic tag with the number on it. "Is there an elevator?" Sarah asked. She looked at her heavy bags. "No," the man replied. "The stairs are over there." Sarah sighed. Her bags were heavy, and her room was on the highest floor. She started to climb the stairs. The stairs were made of dark wood. They were narrow and steep. Every time she stepped, the wood made a noise under her feet. The hotel was very quiet. She did not see any other guests. She only heard the distant sound of cars on the street outside. Finally, she reached the 4th floor. The hallway was dark. There was only one small light on the ceiling. It was flickering. She found room 402 and turned the key. The door opened slowly. The room was small, but it was clean. There was a single bed, a wooden chair, and a small desk. A window looked out over the busy street below. Sarah put her bags on the floor. She was very tired. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked around. She felt a little lonely. She moved from a quiet place to this loud city. She did not know anyone here. She thought about her new job. She wanted to do well. Tomorrow was her first day. She decided to unpack her clothes and then find some dinner. She leaned down to look under the bed. She wanted to check if the floor was clean. That is when she saw something. It was deep in the shadows, near the wall. It was not her bag. It was a suitcase. It was a bright, ocean blue color. It was covered in a thin layer of dust. Sarah reached out her hand. Her heart began to beat faster. Sarah knelt on the floor. The carpet was thin and smelled like old dust. She reached under the bed again. Her fingers touched the cold handle of the suitcase. She pulled it slowly toward her. The suitcase was heavy. It moved across the floor. Finally, it was in the middle of the room. The suitcase was beautiful but old. It was a deep, dark blue, like the ocean at night. The corners were made of brown leather, and the locks were a dull gold color. Sarah blew the dust off the top. A cloud of gray particles filled the air. She coughed and waved her hand to clear the air. "Who left this here?" She asked herself quietly. She looked for a name tag. Most people put their name and phone number on their bags. She turned the suitcase over. There was no tag. There were no stickers from airports or train stations. It was a very clean suitcase, except for the dust. Sarah sat on the floor next to it. She felt a strange curiosity. She knew she should probably call the hotel manager. However, the manager was not very friendly. She remembered his cold smile and his sharp eyes. She did not want to go back down those long, dark stairs again so soon. She tried to move the gold locks. She pushed them with her thumb, but they did not click. They were firmly shut. She tried to slide her finger under the edge of the lid. It was locked very tight. She shook the suitcase gently. Something inside moved. It was not a heavy sound like books. It was a light, sliding sound. Sarah looked at the window. The sun was almost gone now. The sky was a dark purple. The streetlights outside turned on. They cast long, thin shadows across her hotel room. The blue suitcase looked different in the shadows. It looked mysterious. She stood up and brushed the dust off her jeans. She felt a little nervous. This was a strange way to start her first night in the city. She thought about the previous guests of room 402. Did a businessman stay here? Or perhaps a woman like her? Why did they leave such a nice bag behind? She looked at her own bags on the bed. Her life was inside those bags. Her clothes, her books, and her photos. A person does not usually forget their suitcase. It is the most important thing when you travel. Sarah decided to be bureaucratic. She picked up the phone on the small desk. It was an old phone with a long cord. She wanted to tell the manager about the find. But when she picked up the receiver, there was no sound. The phone was dead. She put the phone back down. She looked at the blue suitcase again. It sat there, silent and secret, in the middle of her new room. She felt that her adventure in the city was starting earlier than she expected. Sarah looked at the dead phone in her hand. She felt a little bit of fear, but she was mostly annoyed. She was tired from her trip, and now she had a mystery to solve. She looked at the blue suitcase. "I cannot leave this here," she said to the empty room. "It is not mine." She grabbed the handle of the blue suitcase. It was much heavier than it looked. She opened her door and stepped into the dark hallway. The single light on the ceiling was still flickering. She walked to the stairs and began the long walk down to the lobby. The wooden stairs made loud, creaking noises under her feet. With every step, the heavy suitcase hit the side of her leg. The hotel was very dark and very still. She did not hear any televisions or people talking in other rooms. It felt like she was the only person in the building. When she reached the lobby, the tall, thin man was still behind the desk. He was reading a newspaper. He did not look up when he heard her coming. Sarah walked to the desk and placed the blue suitcase on the floor. The sound of the suitcase hitting the wood was loud in the quiet room. The manager slowly looked up from his newspaper. When his eyes saw the blue suitcase, his face changed. He did not look helpful. He looked surprised and then very angry. His face became pale, and his hands began to shake slightly. "Excuse me," Sarah said politely. "I found this under my bed in room 402. I think a guest forgot it." The manager did not touch the suitcase. He stepped back away from the desk. "That is impossible," he said. His voice was low and sharp. "The room was empty. We cleaned it this morning." "Well, it was there," Sarah insisted. "It was deep under the bed. It has a lot of dust on it. I think it has been there for a long time." The manager shook his head quickly. "No. We do not have a lost and found. I do not want that bag here. Take it away." Sarah was confused. But it is not my bag. You are the manager. You must take it and find the owner. It looks expensive. The manager leaned over the desk. His sharp eyes were now very close to Sarah's face. Listen to me, Miss Miller. There is no owner. That room was vacant for a month. If you found a bag, it is your problem. Do not bring it to my desk again. But the phone in my room is broken, too. Sarah added, trying to stay calm. Everything is fine in this hotel. The man snapped. Go back to your room and stay there. Do not cause trouble. He picked up his newspaper again and ignored her. Sarah stood there for a moment. She felt a cold chill. Why was he so afraid of a suitcase? Why was he being so mean? She realized she would get no help from him. She picked up the handle of the blue suitcase again. She felt the manager's eyes on her back as she walked back to the stairs. She felt very uncomfortable. The blue suitcase was not just a lost object. It was a secret, and the manager knew something about it. Sarah climbed the stairs slowly. The blue suitcase felt much heavier now. Her arms were tired, and her heart was beating fast. She reached the 4th floor and walked quickly to her room. She went inside and turned the heavy metal key in the lock. She pushed a chair in front of the door. For the first time in her life, she did not feel safe in a hotel. She put the suitcase on the small wooden desk. Under the yellow light of the desk lamp, the suitcase looked different. The blue fabric was thick and strong. The leather corners were scratched. Sarah looked at the zipper. It was made of heavy, dark metal. There was a small lock holding the 2 zippers together. It was a combination lock with 3 numbers. I need to know what is inside, Sarah whispered. She thought about the manager's face. He was not just angry. He was terrified. Why was he afraid of a bag? She tried to think of the code. She tried 000. The lock did not move. She tried 123. Nothing happened. She felt a bit of frustration. She was a manager, and she was good at solving problems. She looked around the room for a tool. She found a small metal nail file in her purse. She tried to slide it into the space between the zippers. She pushed hard. The metal made a grinding sound, but the lock was very strong. She sat back in the chair and sighed. She looked at the window. The city was full of lights, but she felt very alone in this strange room. Suddenly, the room became very quiet. The sound of the cars outside disappeared for a moment. That is when she heard it. It was a very soft sound. It came from inside the blue suitcase. Sarah froze. She held her breath and leaned her ear close to the blue fabric. There was a steady, rhythmic clicking sound. It was very faint. It sounded like the heartbeat of a small machine. Sarah jumped back from the desk. Her hands were shaking. Was it a bomb? She watched the suitcase. It did not move. It just sat there, making that low, repetitive sound. She waited for a minute, then 2 minutes. Nothing exploded. The sound continued. It was a mechanical sound, like a very old clock. She felt a mix of fear and intense curiosity. There was something active inside the bag. Someone had put a machine or a device in there, and it was still working. Why did the owner leave it under the bed? And why did the manager want her to keep it? Sarah realized she could not sleep with that sound in the room. She had to open it. She took a deep breath and picked up the nail file again. She decided to use more force. She was not going to let a suitcase scare her. She was going to find the truth. Sarah took a deep breath. She gripped the metal nail file tightly. She placed the tip of the file into the small space between the lock and the suitcase frame. She pushed with all her strength. Her face turned red from the effort. For a moment, Nothing happened. Then, there was a sharp, cracking noise. The gold lock broke into 2 pieces and fell onto the desk. The room was silent again, except for the faint ticking. Sarah's heart was racing. She slowly lifted the lid of the blue suitcase. She expected to see clothes, books, or perhaps something dangerous. But the suitcase was almost empty. The inside was lined with beautiful, soft blue silk. In the middle of the suitcase, there was a small wooden box. Next to the box sat a gold pocket watch. The watch was very old and very beautiful. Its glass face was cracked, but the tiny metal hands were still moving. This was the source of the ticking sound. The watch was still working after all this time. Sarah picked up the watch. It felt heavy and cold in her hand. On the back of the watch, there was an engraving of a small bird. Below the bird, there were 2 letters. JV. JV. Sarah whispered. Who is JV? She put the watch down and opened the small wooden box. Inside, there were no jewels or money. There was only a single piece of white paper. The paper was folded neatly. Sarah took it out and opened it. The paper was old, and the edges were yellow. On the paper, someone had written an address in dark black ink. The handwriting was neat and very formal. It said, 44, Harbour Lane, Apartment 3B. Sarah stared at the address. She did not know the city well, but she had a map in her bag. She pulled out her map of the city and spread it across the bed. She searched for Harbour Lane. She found it near the old docks, close to the river. It was a part of the city with many old warehouses and dark streets. She felt a shiver of excitement. This was not a normal lost suitcase. Someone had hidden these items very carefully. The gold watch was expensive, and the address seemed like a secret message. Why did the hotel manager look so scared when he saw the blue bag? Did he know about JV? Sarah looked at the broken lock on the desk. She knew she was in a strange situation. She was a newcomer in a giant city, and she already had a mystery in her hands. She thought about calling the police, but she remembered the manager's reaction. If the people at the hotel were involved in something bad, maybe the police would not help her. She decided she had to see the address for herself. She could not wait until tomorrow. The ticking of the watch seemed louder now, like a tiny voice telling her to move. She folded the paper and put it in her pocket. She put the gold watch in her purse. She looked at the door. The chair was still leaning against the handle. She felt a little brave now. She was not just a girl in a new city anymore. She was a woman with a mission. The night was very dark now. Outside, the bright lights of the city glowed, but inside room 402, it was cold and quiet. Sarah did not go to the address on Harbour Lane immediately. She felt it was too dangerous to go to a dark part of the city late at night. She decided to wait for the morning sun. She placed the gold watch and the small piece of paper inside her own bag. She kept her bag close to her on the bed. She tried to relax, but her mind was full of questions. Who was JV? Why did the hotel manager look so afraid? She felt like she was in the middle of a movie, but this was her real life. Sarah turned off the small desk lamp. The room became very dark. She lay on the bed with her eyes open. She listened to the sounds of the hotel. She heard the wind blowing against the window. She heard the distant sound of a car horn. Then, the hotel became completely silent. It was exactly midnight when she heard it. There was a sudden, heavy sound on the wooden door of her room. Someone was hitting the door with their hand. It was not a soft sound. It was loud and fast. Sarah sat up quickly. Her heart was beating like a drum in her chest. She did not move. She did not breathe. She waited for the sound to happen again. A few seconds later, there was another series of loud hits on the door. The wooden door shook in its frame. The chair she placed against the handle moved slightly. "Who is it?" Sarah asked. Her voice was small and shaking. There was no answer. The person on the other side of the door did not speak. Sarah stood up and walked slowly toward the door. She was very careful not to make any noise. She looked through the small peephole in the center of the door. The hallway was long and empty. The yellow light on the ceiling was still flickering. She could see the dark carpet and the other closed doors. There was no one there. She waited for a minute, looking through the hole. She saw nothing but the empty, quiet hallway. Sarah felt a cold chill on her neck. She knew she heard someone. The sound was too loud to be a dream. She slowly moved the chair and turned the key. She opened the door just a few centimeters. She looked left, then right. The hallway was completely silent. "Is someone there?" she whispered. The only answer was the sound of the wind in the hallway. She started to close the door, but then she looked down at the floor. There was a small, dark shadow moving near the stairs at the end of the hallway. It looked like a person, but they disappeared around the corner very quickly. Sarah closed the door and locked it again. She pushed the chair back against the handle. She realized that she was not alone in this hotel. Someone knew she had the blue suitcase. Someone was watching her. She did not sleep for the rest of the night. She sat on the bed, holding her bag, and waited for the light of morning. Morning came slowly. The dark purple sky turned into a bright, clear blue. The sunlight was warm on Sarah's face as it moved through the dusty window. She did not sleep much. Every small noise in the hallway made her jump. She felt like she was in a trap, but the light of day gave her a little courage. She sat at the small wooden desk. She took out her laptop and opened it. The screen was very bright in the quiet room. She typed the letters JV into the search bar. Many things appeared, but nothing looked right. Then, she thought about the gold watch. It was expensive and very old. She thought of names that started with those letters. She typed Julian Vane and pressed the search button. Suddenly, her screen was full of news articles. The most recent headline was from exactly 1 month ago. It said, "Famous engineer Julian Vane disappears." Sarah read the article quickly. Her heart was beating fast. The article said that Julian Vane was a very smart man. He worked for a big technology company in the center of the city. One evening, he left his office and never came home. The police found his car near the river, but they did not find Julian. He was 45 years old. He lived alone and had no family in the city. There was a photo of him in the article. He was a tall man with kind eyes and a short beard. He looked like a serious and honest person. Sarah looked at the photo. Then she looked at the gold watch on the desk. She was sure the watch belonged to him. The initials JV were a perfect match. Why was his suitcase under my bed? She asked herself. The article also mentioned that Julian Vane was working on a secret project before he disappeared. The company said they did not know where he went. However, the news report said that Julian was worried about something. He told a friend that he felt someone was watching him. He was afraid for his life. Sarah felt a cold chill. The man at the reception desk lied to her. He said the room was empty for a month. But Julian Vane disappeared exactly 1 month ago. This meant Julian was likely the last person to stay in room 402. The manager knew about Julian Vane. He was trying to hide the truth from her. Sarah looked at the address on the piece of paper. 44, Harbour Lane. This was the only real clue. Julian Vane left the blue suitcase for a reason. He wanted someone to find it. Now, Sarah was the person with the secret. She felt a heavy responsibility. She was not just a guest in a hotel anymore. She was part of a dangerous mystery. She closed her laptop and put it in her bag. She took the blue suitcase and pushed it back under the bed, deep in the shadows where it was before. She only took the watch and the paper with her. She had to be very careful. She walked to the door and listened. The hallway was quiet. She opened the door and walked toward the stairs. It was time to find out what happened to Julian Vane. Sarah walked through the hotel lobby. She did not look at the manager. She could feel his eyes on her back, but she kept her head down. She walked out of the heavy front door and into the city. The bright morning sun was gone. Dark, heavy clouds now covered the sky. The air was thick and cold. A few minutes later, it began to rain. At first, it was a light mist. Then, the rain became heavy. The water hit the pavement with a steady, loud noise. People on the street opened their umbrellas and walked faster. Sarah did not have an umbrella. She pulled her coat tightly around her and started to walk toward the river. The city changed as she walked. The tall, glass buildings disappeared. In their place were old, grey buildings made of brick. The streets were narrow and dirty. There were no bright signs or happy shoppers here. This was the old part of the city near the docks. The air smelled like salt, wet wood, and old smoke. Sarah looked at the paper in her hand. The rain was making the ink a little blurry, but she could still read the words. 44, Harbour Lane. She checked her map. She was very close. She turned a corner and found herself on a long, dark street. The street was empty. The only sound was the heavy rain falling on the metal roofs of the warehouses. Harbour Lane was a lonely place. Most of the windows in the buildings were broken or covered with wood. There were no lights in the houses. It looked like a place where people went to hide. Sarah felt a small knot of fear in her stomach. She thought about turning back. She thought about her warm room and her safe life in the village. But then she felt the gold watch in her bag. She thought about Julian Vane. He was a good man. And he was missing. I have to find the truth. She whispered to herself. The rain was cold, and her clothes were wet. She walked past a small park with dead grass and a broken fence. Finally, she saw a large, dark building at the end of the street. It was a tall house with a black door. A small, rusty metal number was attached to the wall. 44. Sarah stood in front of the house. The windows looked like dark eyes watching her. The building felt heavy and sad. She looked at the door. There was no bell, only a heavy iron knocker. She took a deep breath. Her hand was shaking as she reached for the knocker. She looked behind her. The street was still empty, but she felt like someone was watching her from the shadows. The rain continued to fall, washing the streets and making everything look grey and silver. Sarah lifted the heavy iron knocker and hit the door 3 times. The sound was very loud in the quiet street. She waited, but no one answered. The heavy black door did not open after Sarah's first knock. She waited in the cold rain. Her hair was wet, and her shoes were full of water. She felt like she should leave, but something told her to try the door handle. She reached out and turned the cold metal. To her surprise, the door was not locked. It opened with a long, slow groan of old metal. Sarah stepped inside. The air inside the building was different from the air outside. It was not wet, but it was very cold and smelled like old paper and dry wood. She stood in a small lobby. The floor was made of grey stone, and it was covered in dust. There were no lights on the walls. The only light came from the open door behind her. She looked at a small wooden board on the wall. It was a directory for the building. Most of the names were missing or faded. However, near the top, she saw the number 3B. Next to it, there was a small piece of white tape. On the tape, someone had written Vane Engineering in small, neat letters. "This is the place," Sarah said quietly. Her voice sounded very loud in the empty lobby. She found the stairs. They were made of iron and looked very strong. She began to climb. The sound of her footsteps hit the metal and echoed through the building. She reached the second floor and then the third. The hallway on the third floor was narrow. There were 4 doors. She walked past 3A. Then, she reached the door marked 3B. This door was made of dark wood with a small glass window. The glass was so dirty that she could not see inside. Sarah turned the handle. This door was also unlocked. She pushed it open and stepped into the room. It was not an apartment. It was a small office. There was a large wooden desk in the middle of the room. A tall bookshelf stood against the wall, but most of the books were on the floor. There were papers everywhere. Some were on the desk, and others were scattered across the carpet. Sarah walked to the desk. She saw large drawings of machines and buildings. They were very detailed and beautiful. She saw the name Julian Vane at the bottom of every drawing. This was his private office. It looked like someone had searched the room very quickly. Drawers were open, and a chair was knocked over on its side. Sarah felt a heavy sadness. Julian Vane worked here. He spent many hours at this desk, planning and thinking. Now, the room was empty and cold. She walked to the window. The office looked out over the river. The water was grey and moved quickly under the rain. She looked down at the desk again. In the center of the mess, she saw a small, red notebook. It was the only thing that looked clean. She reached out to touch it, but then she stopped. She felt a strange sensation, like a cold wind on the back of her neck. She was not alone. Sarah stood very still. Her heart was beating fast in her chest. She did not turn around to look at the door behind her. She felt a cold wind from the hallway, but the feeling of being watched did not come from the door. It came from the window in front of her. She slowly looked at the window. The rain was still hitting the glass with a steady rhythm. Beyond the rain and the grey mist, there was another building. It was an old warehouse made of dark bricks. It had many large, empty windows. In one of those windows, directly across from Julian's office, a person was standing. The person was a man. He was very tall and thin. He wore a long, dark coat and a black hat that covered his hair. His face was in the dark, so Sarah could not see his eyes or his expression. But she knew he was looking at her. He did not move a muscle. He was like a statue made of shadows. Sarah felt a deep, cold fear. Was this the same person who knocked on her door at the hotel? Was this the person she saw near the stairs? She did not know for sure, but she was certain that he was dangerous. He was watching the office of Julian Vane. He was waiting for someone to come and find the secrets. And now, that person was her. She looked down at the small, red notebook on the desk. She knew she had to take it. It was a clue. It was important to the mystery of the blue suitcase. Her hand was shaking, but she reached out and grabbed the notebook. She pushed it quickly into her bag and zipped it shut. The man in the window still did not move. He just watched her. The silence in the office was heavy and thick. Sarah felt like she could not breathe. She needed to leave this building immediately. This office was no longer a place of answers. It was a trap. She began to back away from the desk. She kept her eyes on the window. She did not want to look away from the man in the dark coat. She reached the door of the office and stepped out into the dark hallway. She did not run yet, because she did not want to make a loud noise. She wanted to be like a shadow, too. She walked to the iron stairs. She looked down the center of the staircase. It was a long way down to the lobby. The building felt like a giant, empty cage. She started to walk down the stairs, faster and faster. Her wet shoes made a soft, sticky sound on the metal steps. When she reached the first floor, she looked through the glass of the front door. The street was empty and grey. The rain was still falling. She looked at the building across the street one last time. The window where the man stood was now empty. He was gone. Sarah pushed the front door open and stepped into the cold rain. She did not know where the man went. He could be anywhere. He could be waiting behind the next corner or standing in a dark doorway. She started to run. She did not look back. She just wanted to find a place with many people and bright lights. She needed to be safe. Sarah ran as fast as she could. The rain was very heavy now. The water felt like ice on her face. Her lungs began to burn. But she did not stop. She turned a corner and looked behind her. The street was dark and empty. But then she saw it. A shadow moved near a brick wall. It was the man in the long, dark coat. He was not running. He walked with long, steady steps. He was fast. He was like a ghost in the rain. Sarah's heart beat loudly in her chest. She felt a sharp pain in her side. But she pushed herself to move faster. She held her bag tightly against her body. The red notebook was inside, and she knew the man wanted it. Help! She tried to shout, but her voice was weak. The wind took her words away. She reached a larger street. There were a few cars, but the drivers did not see her in the storm. She saw the bright neon sign for the subway. It was a yellow circle with a black S in the middle. It looked like a door to safety. Sarah ran toward the stairs. Her wet shoes made a slippery sound on the stone steps. She ran down into the station. The air inside was warm and smelled like old metal and electricity. The station was mostly empty because it was late. Sarah did not have time to look for her transit card. She saw a train standing at the platform. The lights inside the train were bright and yellow. Sarah jumped over the metal turnstile. A station worker in a blue uniform stood near a booth. "Hey! You must pay!" The worker shouted. Sarah did not stop. "I'm sorry!" She cried out over her shoulder. She reached the edge of the platform. The train made a long, low sound of rushing air. The doors began to slide shut. Sarah did not think. She jumped through the small opening. Her shoulder hit the rubber edge of the door, but she landed inside the car. The doors closed with a firm, heavy thud. Sarah fell onto the floor. She stayed there for a moment, breathing hard. She looked up and through the thick glass window of the door. The tall man was standing on the platform. He was only 2 meters away. Now that he was under the station lights, Sarah could see him better. He had very pale skin and a long, thin nose. His eyes were dark and very cold. He did not look angry or surprised. He just stood there, perfectly still, watching her. The train began to move. It pulled away from the platform. The man stayed in the same spot. He became smaller and smaller as the train entered the dark tunnel. Sarah moved away from the door and sat on a plastic seat. Her clothes were soaking wet, and she was shaking from the cold and the fear. She was safe for now, but she knew the truth. The man in the dark coat knew who she was. He knew she had Julian Vane's notebook. This was no longer just a mystery. It was a race for her life. Sarah sat on the bright train and tried to stop her hands from shaking. Her coat was heavy with water. She looked at the other people on the train. There was an old man reading a book and a woman in a business suit. They looked normal. They were not running from a mysterious man in a dark coat. Sarah felt like she was in a different world. She reached into her bag and pulled out her mobile phone. The screen was wet, but it still worked. She needed to talk to someone. She could not go back to the Hotel Blue. The manager was part of the problem, and the man with the cold eyes knew where she lived. She had no home and no friends in this giant city. Then, she remembered Mark. Mark was an old friend from university. They were very close many years ago. Mark was always curious and loved to solve puzzles. Now, He lived in this city and worked as a journalist for a famous newspaper. He wrote stories about crime and secrets. Sarah found his name in her phone and pressed the call button. The phone made a soft, repeating sound as she waited for him to answer. Sarah held the phone tightly to her ear. Finally, a man's voice spoke. "Hello, Sarah. Is that you?" Mark asked. He sounded surprised. "It is very late. I have not heard from you in years." "Mark, please help me," Sarah said. Her voice was thin and weak. "I am in the city. Something very strange is happening. I am afraid." The line was quiet for a second. Then, Mark's voice became serious. "Sarah, calm down. Tell me everything. Where are you right now?" "I am on the subway," Sarah replied. "I found a suitcase. It belongs to a man named Julian Vane. He is missing. A tall man is following me, and he looks dangerous. I saw him at an old office on Harbour Lane." "Julian Vane," Mark whispered. "Wait. I know that name. I am writing a story about him. People say he just disappeared, but some think it was not an accident. Sarah, if you have his things, you are in a lot of trouble." Sarah felt a new wave of fear. "What should I do, Mark?" "I cannot go back to my hotel. I think the manager is watching me." "Do not go back there," Mark said quickly. "Listen to me. Get off the train at the next stop. It is a busy station with many lights and many people. There are security cameras there. Walk to the cafe called the Golden Bean across the street. Stay where there are many people. I will meet you there in 20 minutes. "Thank you, Mark," Sarah said. She felt a little bit of hope. "Be careful, Sarah," Mark added. "Do not talk to anyone. Keep your bag close to you. I am coming now." The train made a loud, grinding noise as it slowed down. The doors opened at a station with white walls and bright lights. Sarah stood up. She looked at her reflection in the train window. She looked tired, but her eyes were determined. She stepped out onto the platform. She was not alone anymore. She had a friend, and together, they would find the truth. The Golden Bean was a warm and bright cafe. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air. There were many people sitting at small tables with their laptops or talking to friends. Sarah sat in a corner booth, far from the large glass window. She held a cup of hot tea with both hands. Her clothes were still a little damp, but she felt safer here. A few minutes later, the door opened. A man with messy brown hair and a tan coat walked in. He looked around the room quickly. When he saw Sarah, his face changed from worry to relief. It was Mark. He was older now, but he had the same kind face Sarah remembered from their university days. "Sarah," Mark said as he sat down across from her. He looked at her wet hair and tired eyes. "You look like you walked through a river. It has been a very long night, Mark," Sarah said. She spoke in a low voice. She did not want the other customers to hear. "Tell me everything. Start from the beginning," Mark said. Sarah told him about the Hotel Blue, the cold manager, and the blue suitcase under the bed. She described the man in the long, dark coat and the office on Harbour Lane. Mark listened carefully. He did not interrupt her. He took a small notebook and wrote down some names. When she finished, he looked very serious. "This is bigger than I thought," Mark whispered. Julian Vane was a genius engineer. He was working on a new type of battery for a very powerful company. If he found something wrong with the company, they would want to stop him. "I found this in the suitcase," Sarah said. She reached into her bag and pulled out the gold watch. She placed it on the wooden table between them. Mark picked up the watch. He looked at the gold surface and the cracked glass. It's a beautiful piece. Very old. He turned it over and looked at the engraving of the small bird and the letters J. V. Wait. Mark said. He pulled a small magnifying glass from his pocket. He was a journalist, so he always carried tools for his work. He held the watch close to the light of the cafe. There is something else here. Sarah leaned forward. What is it? Look at the bird. Mark pointed to the small engraving. The wings of the bird are not just lines. They are numbers and letters. They are very, very small. Most people would never see them. Sarah looked closely. Under the magnifying glass, she saw tiny marks in the gold. It was a code. What does it mean? Sarah asked. I don't know yet. Mark replied. But Julian Vane was an engineer. He liked systems and patterns. This is not just a decoration. This is a key to something. Maybe it is a password, or maybe it is a location. Mark looked at the door of the cafe. He seemed nervous now. Sarah, we cannot stay here. If that man followed you to the subway, he might find this place. We need to go to my office. I have a computer there that can help us break this code. Sarah nodded. She put the watch back in her bag. She felt a new spark of hope. They had a code, and she had a friend. The mystery of the blue suitcase was finally starting to open. Sarah held her warm cup, but she felt cold. The bright lights of the cafe did not make her feel safe anymore. She looked at Mark. He was looking at the gold watch again. His face was very serious. Mark. Sarah said quietly, I also found this. She reached into her bag and pulled out the small, red notebook. Mark's eyes went wide. He took the notebook with careful hands. He opened it and looked at the pages. The handwriting was the same as the address on the paper. It was full of dates, times, and names of people. Many of the names belonged to important directors at a company called Nova Energy. This is amazing. Sarah. Mark whispered. This notebook is a diary. Julian Vane wrote about his meetings. He wrote that the company was lying about their new project. He was afraid they were doing something illegal. As Mark spoke, Sarah looked toward the large glass window of the cafe. The rain was still falling. Across the street, a black car was parked near a fire hydrant. The engine was running because she could see white smoke coming from the back. The windows of the car were very dark. She could not see the driver, but the car was facing the cafe. Mark. Sarah said, her voice shaking. Look at that car. Mark looked at the window. He watched the car for a minute. Then, the door of the car opened a little bit. A man stepped out. He was not the tall man in the dark coat. This man was short and wore a grey suit. He stood under a black umbrella and looked directly into the cafe. He held a phone to his ear and seemed to be talking to someone. Is he looking at us? Sarah asked. I think so. Mark said. He closed the red notebook and put it in his own coat pocket. He does not look like a normal person. He looks like he is waiting. Suddenly, the man in the grey suit looked at his phone and then looked at their table. He started to walk toward the cafe door. We need to leave. Mark said quickly. Now. But do not go out the front door. Mark stood up and grabbed his bag. Sarah did the same. They walked quickly toward the back of the cafe. There was a small door near the kitchen. A sign on the door said, Employees only. What are you doing? Sarah asked. Trust me. Mark said. He pushed the door open. They walked through a small, bright kitchen. A cook in a white hat looked at them with surprise. Hey! You can't be here. He shouted. Sorry, we are in a hurry. Mark called back. They reached the back exit. Mark pushed a heavy metal bar on the door. It opened with a loud, metallic groan. They stepped out into a narrow, dark alley. The air was cold, and the ground was wet with rain and oil. "My car is parked 3 blocks away," Mark said. "We have to be fast. If they see us, we are in trouble." They began to run through the alley. Sarah's heart was pounding. She felt like a character in a spy book. Every shadow looked like a person. Every sound of the wind felt like a footstep. She realized that the mystery of the blue suitcase was much more dangerous than a simple lost bag. It was a secret that powerful people wanted to keep. Mark's car was a small, silver sedan. It was parked under a dim streetlight. They got inside and Mark immediately locked all the doors. He started the engine, and the car began to move away from the dark alley. "We need that suitcase, Sarah," Mark said. He looked at the mirrors to see if the black car was following them. If Julian Vane hid a watch and a notebook, there might be more secrets inside the bag itself. "It is still under the bed in room 402. Sarah replied. She felt a bit sick. Going back to the hotel Blue felt like walking into a lion's den. "The manager is suspicious. He does not want me to have that bag." "We will be quick," Mark promised. "I will wait in the car with the engine running. You go in, grab the bag, and come straight back out. Do not talk to anyone." They reached the hotel 10 minutes later. The street was quiet, and the rain had turned into a light drizzle. Sarah felt her heart racing as she stepped out of the car. She walked into the lobby. The tall, thin manager was not at the desk. A small bell sat on the wood, but the room was empty. Sarah did not wait. She ran up the creaking wooden stairs as fast as she could. Inside room 402, everything looked the same. She knelt down and reached under the bed. Her fingers hit the cold, blue fabric. She pulled the suitcase out. It was still heavy. She didn't want to carry it down the stairs openly, so she put her large coat over it. Before she left, she sat on the floor for a second. She remembered the clicking sound from earlier. She ran her hands along the inside of the suitcase. The blue silk lining felt soft, but near the bottom corner, it felt different. There was something stiff behind the fabric. Sarah found a small hole in the silk. She put her finger inside and pulled. There was a soft sound of tearing cloth. Behind the blue silk, a piece of thick, yellow paper was hidden. She pulled it out slowly. It was a map. But it was not a map of the city. It was a hand-drawn map of a forest and a large lake. There were small symbols for trees and a path. In the middle of the map, there was a red X near a small square. Below the square, the word Oak Haven was written in neat letters. Oak Haven. Sarah whispered. She had never heard of it. She quickly folded the map and put it inside her pocket. She grabbed the handle of the blue suitcase and hid it under her coat. She hurried out of the room and down the stairs. The lobby was still empty. She pushed the front door open and ran to Mark's car. She jumped into the passenger seat and slammed the door. "I got it," she panted. "And I found something else. A map to a place called Oak Haven." Mark looked at the suitcase and then at Sarah. "Oak Haven. That is a small town 2 hours away from here. Why would Julian have a map of a lake house there?" "I don't know," Sarah said. "But someone is looking for this. We need to get away from here." As Mark pulled away from the sidewalk, Sarah looked up at the 4th floor of the hotel. For a brief second, she thought she saw a shadow move in the window of her room. Mark drove the car away from the hotel. Sarah sat in the passenger seat and held the blue suitcase on her lap. She felt better now that she had the bag, but she was still very nervous. She looked at the small silver watch and the red notebook in her bag. Then, She remembered something. Her heart sank. "Mark, stop the car," Sarah said. Her voice was full of worry. "What is it?" Mark asked. He did not stop, but he slowed down. "I left my passport and my laptop in the room," Sarah explained. "They are in my black backpack near the desk. I need my passport. I cannot travel to Oak Haven without it." Mark looked at the clock on the dashboard. It was very late. He looked at the dark street behind them. No cars were following them. "Okay," he said. "We will go back. But we must be very, very fast. I don't like this, Sarah." He turned the car around. They arrived at the Hotel Blue again. This time, the lobby was not empty. The manager was standing by the front door. He was looking at the street. When he saw Mark's car, he stepped back into the shadows. "Stay here," Sarah said. "I know where my things are. I will be back in 2 minutes." She ran inside. She did not look at the manager. She ran up the stairs. Her legs were tired, but the fear gave her energy. She reached the 4th floor. The hallway felt colder than before. She reached room 402 and put her key in the lock. The door was already open a little bit. Sarah pushed the door. She expected to see her quiet room. Instead, she saw a disaster. Her clothes were all over the floor. Her black backpack was open, and her books were torn. Someone had searched the room very quickly and very violently. She looked at the desk. Her laptop was gone. She looked for her passport. She found it on the floor under the chair. She grabbed it and put it in her pocket. Then, she felt a cold wind. She turned around. The window of the room was wide open. The glass was not broken, but the lock was snapped. The white curtains were blowing in the wind like ghosts. Sarah walked to the window and looked out. There was a small metal fire escape outside. She realized the tall man did not use the stairs. He climbed the building. Sarah felt a cold chill. The man was in this room only a few minutes ago. Maybe he was still nearby. She did not wait another second. She ran out of the room and down the stairs. She did not use the stairs normally. She almost fell down them because she was so fast. She ran through the lobby and out the front door. She jumped into Mark's car. "Go! Go now!" she shouted. Mark pushed the gas pedal, and the car moved away fast. Sarah looked back at the hotel. In the window of room 402, she saw a white curtain flying in the dark night. Her room was no longer hers. It was a crime scene. She had her passport, but she lost her laptop and her peace of mind. Now, they only had one place to go. Mark's office. Mark's office was located in a tall, modern building in the center of the city. The lobby was very bright and had a security guard at a large desk. Sarah felt a little safer here. They took the elevator to the 6th floor. Mark's office was small and crowded. There were many books about law and crime on the shelves. There were also many old newspapers on the floor. "Stay here and lock the door," Mark said. He sat down at his desk and turned on his computer. The blue light from the screen made the room look cold. Sarah sat on a small sofa. She held the blue suitcase close to her. She watched Mark as he typed quickly on his keyboard. He looked very focused. He was a good journalist, and he knew how to find information that was hidden. "I have a friend in the police department," Mark explained. "He gave me a special password to see the official police reports. I want to see the original file on Julian Vane's disappearance. I want to know who was the last person to see him." Sarah waited in silence. She looked at the shadows on the wall. She thought about the man in the dark coat. Was he still outside? Was he waiting for them to leave the building? The city felt like a giant maze, and they were the mice. Suddenly, Mark stopped typing. He leaned closer to the screen. He rubbed his eyes and shook his head. This is not possible. He whispered. What is it? Sarah asked. She stood up and walked to the desk. The file for Julian Vane is gone. Mark said. He pointed at the screen. There was a message in red letters that said, "File not found." I saw this file 2 weeks ago. It was full of information. It had photos of his car and interviews with his neighbors. Now, it is completely deleted. Sarah felt a heavy weight in her chest. How can a police file just disappear? Someone with a lot of power deleted it. Mark replied. He looked at Sarah with a worried expression. This means the people following us are not just criminals. They have friends in the government or the police. They are trying to erase Julian Vane from history. They want everyone to forget he ever existed. Sarah looked at the blue suitcase. But they didn't get the suitcase. They didn't get the notebook or the watch. Exactly. Mark said. That is why they are so desperate. You have the only evidence that Julian Vane was a real person with a real secret. This notebook and the map to Oak Haven are the only things that can stop them. Mark stood up and grabbed his coat. We cannot stay here. Sarah. If they can delete a police file, they can find us in this building. We need to go to Oak Haven tonight. We need to follow that map before they catch us. Sarah nodded. She was tired, but she knew Mark was right. They were in the middle of a very big and dangerous game. The missing file was a warning. The enemy was everywhere, and they were very powerful. Mark and Sarah walked quickly out of the office building. The night air was very cold now. The rain had stopped, but the ground was still wet and shiny under the streetlights. They walked toward Mark's car. Sarah held her bag tightly. She felt like every shadow moved when she looked at it. Suddenly, Sarah's phone began to vibrate in her pocket. The vibration felt strong against her leg. She stopped walking and pulled the phone out. The screen showed a number she did not know. There were no names, just a long string of digits. Don't answer it. Mark whispered. What if it is Julian? Sarah asked. She felt a small hope in her heart. She pressed the green button and put the phone to her ear. Hello. Miss Miller. A voice said. The voice was very calm and very deep. It did not sound like Julian Vane. It sounded like the cold wind. You have something that belongs to my company. You have the blue suitcase and the red notebook. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Who are you? Where is Julian Vane? That is not important. The man replied. What is important is your safety, and the safety of your friend, the journalist. If you want to stay safe, you must meet me. Now. Where? Sarah asked. Her voice was shaking. The city park. Near the old stone bridge. The man said. Come alone. Bring the blue suitcase. If I see the police, or if you do not come, you will never see the truth. You have 20 minutes. The line went silent. The man ended the call. Sarah looked at Mark. Her face was very pale. She told him what the man said. You cannot go alone. Sarah. Mark said firmly. It is a trap. They want the evidence, and then they will hurt you. But he knew your name. Mark. He knew you were with me. Sarah said. He is watching us right now. If we don't go, he might hurt you to get to me. I have to go to the park. Mark thought for a moment. He looked at the dark streets. Okay. We will go. But you will not be alone. I will drive you there. I will stay in the trees near the bridge. I will watch you from the shadows. If anything goes wrong, I will call for help. They got into the car and drove toward the park. The city park was a large, dark forest in the middle of the tall buildings. At night, it was a lonely place. There were no lights on the paths. The trees looked like giant fingers reaching for the sky. They reached the park entrance. Mark turned off the car lights. The stone bridge is at the center of the park. He said, "Take the suitcase. I will follow you slowly through the grass. Be brave, Sarah." Sarah stepped out of the car. She felt the heavy weight of the blue suitcase in her hand. She walked onto the dark path. The only sound was the crunch of dry leaves under her feet. She walked toward the bridge, wondering who was waiting for her in the dark. The stone bridge was old and narrow. The grey stones were cold and wet from the earlier rain. Sarah walked onto the bridge. Her footsteps made a soft, hollow sound on the rock. The park was full of mist. The white fog moved between the trees like a slow river. She could not see Mark, but she hoped he was close by in the darkness. In the middle of the bridge, Sarah stopped. She saw a shape on the ground. At first, she thought it was a person sitting down. She felt a wave of fear and stopped moving. But the shape did not move. It was rectangular and dark. She walked 3 more steps. It was a suitcase. Sarah stared at it. Her hands began to shake. The suitcase on the bridge was exactly like the one in her hand. It was the same bright, ocean blue color. It had the same brown leather corners and gold locks. It looked brand new, with no dust or scratches. "Is someone there?" Sarah called out. Her voice was thin. It disappeared into the fog. No one answered. The only sound was the wind moving through the branches of the trees. Sarah looked around. She could see the dark shapes of the bushes, but she could not see a face. She knelt down next to the second suitcase. She placed her suitcase, the one with the secrets, on the ground next to it. The locks on this new suitcase were not locked. Sarah pushed the gold buttons. They moved easily. She lifted the lid. She expected to find more clues, perhaps another notebook or a map. The suitcase was empty. There were no clothes. There was no hidden lining. There was no gold watch ticking inside. It was just a hollow blue box. Sarah felt a cold knot in her stomach. This was a message. This was a way for the man in the dark coat to show her that he could find anything. He could even find a perfect copy of the suitcase she was trying to protect. "This is a game," she whispered. Suddenly, she saw something white on the inside of the lid. It was a small piece of tape with a message written on it. It said, "You are carrying a heavy burden. Sarah, drop it." Sarah stood up quickly. She felt like someone was standing right behind her. She turned around, but the bridge was empty. She looked toward the trees where Mark was hiding. She saw a small light flash twice. It was Mark's flashlight. It was a signal to leave. She did not want to leave the empty suitcase there, but she knew she had to go. She picked up her original blue suitcase. As she turned to run back toward the park entrance, her foot hit something small on the ground. It was not a stone. It was a piece of plastic. She picked it up and held it toward the distant light of a street lamp. It was an identification card. It had a photo of a man with kind eyes and a short beard. The name on the card was Julian Vane. Sarah ran through the tall, wet grass. The blue suitcase was heavy in her hand, but she did not stop. She reached the trees where she saw Mark's light. Mark stepped out from behind a large oak tree. His face was full of worry. He grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the path. "We need to go, Sarah," Mark whispered. "I saw a shadow moving near the bridge after you turned around. Someone was definitely there." "Mark, look at this," Sarah said. She held out the small plastic card she found on the bridge. "It's Julian's ID. I found it on the ground. Mark looked at the card for a second. Then he looked at the dark path ahead. Keep it safe. But we can't stay here to talk. The car is near the park exit. Let's move. They walked quickly toward the edge of the park. The streetlights from the city were visible now, but they were still far away. The park was very quiet. The only sound was their breathing and the soft noise of their shoes on the dirt path. Sarah felt like the trees were closing in on her. She felt the weight of the red notebook and the gold watch in her bag. These objects felt like they were getting heavier. As they reached the metal gate at the park exit, Sarah stopped. There was a large, green trash can near the gate. The light from a nearby street lamp hit something shiny inside the bin. It was resting on top of some old newspapers. Sarah felt a strange pull. She stepped toward the trash can. "Sarah, what are you doing?" Mark asked. He was already at the gate, looking at his car. "I see something," Sarah replied. She reached into the trash can. Her fingers touched something cold and plastic. She pulled it out. It was another identification card. She held it up to the light. Her eyes went wide. It was the same identification card she had in her pocket. It had the same photo of Julian Vane. It had the same name and the same expiration date. "Mark," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "I have two. I found one on the bridge, and I found one here in the trash. Why are there two?" Mark walked back to her and looked at the two cards in her hand. He took them and compared them. "One is real," he said slowly. "The other is a very good copy. Look at the edges. This one from the trash is slightly different." Sarah felt a cold shiver. Why would someone leave a fake ID and a real ID for me to find? "It's a trail," Mark said. "They are leading us somewhere. They want us to follow these clues. They are not hiding Julian Vane anymore. They are using him to bring us to them." He looked at the dark street. His silver car was waiting, but it looked small and lonely in the big city. "We cannot stay in this city, Sarah. They know every street and every building. We need to go to Oak Haven now. The map in the suitcase is our only chance to find the real Julian before they find us." Sarah nodded. She put both ID cards in her pocket. She felt like she was walking into a giant trap, but she had no other choice. They walked through the gate, got into the car, and drove away from the park. Behind them, the city lights looked like cold, unblinking eyes. The silver car moved quickly on the long highway. The bright lights of the city were now far behind them. Outside the window, the world was black and silent. Mark kept his eyes on the road. He looked tired, but he did not stop. Sarah sat in the passenger seat with the blue suitcase on her lap. She felt the heavy weight of it on her legs. "I still feel like there is more," Sarah said quietly. She ran her hands over the blue fabric of the suitcase again. She felt the leather corners and the gold locks. She remembered the map she found in the lining earlier. But the suitcase still felt too heavy for just a notebook and a watch. She turned the suitcase over and looked at the bottom. The bottom of the suitcase was hard. It was covered in a thick layer of dark blue material. Sarah pressed her fingers into the corners. Near the left wheel, she felt a small bump. It was not a flat surface. It felt like a small, hard object was trapped behind the plastic frame. "Mark, give me your pocket knife," Sarah said. Mark reached into his coat and handed her a small metal knife. "Be careful, Sarah. Don't hurt yourself." Sarah used the tip of the knife to move the edge of the fabric. She was very slow and very careful. She did not want to ruin the beautiful suitcase, but she needed to know the truth. She pulled the material back. Behind the plastic frame, there was a tiny, hidden pocket. It was made of black cloth and was almost invisible. She put 2 fingers into the pocket. She felt something cold and metal. She pulled it out slowly. It was a key. But it was not a normal key for a house or a car. It was a long, silver key with a very complex shape at the end. It looked like the keys used for high-security lockers. On the top of the key, there was a small number engraved in the metal. 305. Next to the number, there was a small symbol of a lion. "Mark, look at this," Sarah said. She held the key up so the light from the dashboard hit it. Mark looked at the key for a second. His eyes went wide. "That symbol," he whispered. "That is the symbol of the central bank of the city. It is the oldest and most secure bank in the country." Locker 305. Sarah read the numbers. Julian Vane did not just hide a notebook. He hid something in a bank. Something very important. "This changes everything," Mark said. He gripped the steering wheel tighter. "The notebook tells us about the crime. The map shows us where to go. But this key leads to the proof. Whatever is in locker 305 is what the man in the dark coat is really looking for." Sarah looked at the silver key. It was small, but it felt very heavy. She realized that they were not just following a trail. They were holding the most important secret in the city. She put the key in her pocket and looked out at the dark road. The journey to Oak Haven was important, but she knew they would have to return to the city soon. The heart of the mystery was locked inside a silver box in a cold stone bank. The morning sun began to rise over the city. The sky was a mix of pink and orange. Mark drove the car back into the center of the city. They were both very tired, but they could not sleep. The silver key was burning a hole in Sarah's pocket. It was the most important clue they had. "We have to do this now," Mark said. "The bank opens at 8 o'clock. If we wait, the people following us might find the key." They reached the central bank just as the doors opened. It was a massive building made of white stone. Huge pillars stood at the entrance, making it look like an ancient temple. Sarah felt very small as she stood in front of it. She looked at her reflection in the glass doors. She looked tired, and her clothes were a bit messy from the rain. But her face was determined. "I will wait in the car," Mark said. "If I go in, they might recognize me. A journalist in a bank vault looks suspicious. You are just a customer." Sarah nodded. She took a deep breath and walked inside. The lobby of the bank was giant. The ceiling was very high, and the floor was made of black and white marble. It was so quiet that she could hear the sound of her own breathing. There were many people in suits walking quickly, but no one looked at her. She walked to a large wooden desk. Behind the desk sat a woman with silver hair and a very professional smile. "Good morning," the woman said. "How can I help you?" "I have a key for a safe deposit box," Sarah said. She tried to keep her voice steady. "Locker 305. The woman's smile stayed the same, but her eyes looked at Sarah's clothes for a second. "Of course. Do you have your identification and the key?" Sarah handed her the passport she had rescued from the hotel and the silver key with the lion symbol. The woman looked at the passport. Then she looked at a computer screen. She typed something for a long time. Sarah's heart began to beat faster. Was there a problem? Was the police looking for this key? Finally, the woman stood up. "Everything is in order. Miss Miller, please follow me." They walked through a heavy metal door. Behind it was a long hallway with thick carpet. At the end of the hallway, there was a giant round door made of steel. It was the vault. A security guard stood next to it. He was a big man with a serious face. He looked at Sarah's ID and then opened the heavy steel door. Inside the vault, the air was cool and smelled like old metal. The walls were covered from floor to ceiling with small silver doors. Each door had a number. "Here we are," the woman said. "Locker 305. The woman used a second key, and Sarah used her silver key. Together, they turned the locks. The small door opened. Inside was a metal box. "I will leave you alone now," the woman said. She walked out of the vault. Sarah pulled the metal box out. It was heavy. She placed it on a small table in the center of the room. Her hands were shaking. She reached for the lid. She was finally going to see what Julian Vane wanted to protect so badly. Sarah stood alone in the center of the vault. The metal box was on the table in front of her. She reached for the lid, but she stopped. She heard a noise behind her. The heavy steel door of the vault moved. It did not make a loud sound, but Sarah felt the air change. She turned around quickly. The security guard was standing in the doorway. He was a very large man with a thick neck and a gray uniform. His face was hard and did not show any feelings. He did not say anything at first. He just stood there and watched her. His eyes moved from Sarah's face to the metal box on the table. "Is there a problem?" Sarah asked. She tried to make her voice sound strong, but she felt very small. The guard walked into the room. The sound of his heavy boots on the marble floor was slow and steady. He stopped 2 meters away from her. "I need to see your identification again," he said. His voice was deep and very cold. The lady at the desk already checked it. Sarah replied. Her heart was beating fast. "I need to check it again." The guard repeated. He held out a large hand. Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out her passport. She gave it to him. The guard looked at the photo for a long time. Then he looked at Sarah. He looked at her messy hair and her tired eyes. He looked like he did not believe she was Sarah Miller. "Wait here," he said. He did not give the passport back. He turned around and walked out of the vault. The heavy door stayed open just a little bit. Sarah felt a wave of panic. Why did he take her passport? Was he calling the police? Or was he calling the man in the dark coat? She knew she did not have much time. She had to see what was in the box before the guard came back. She turned to the table and lifted the lid of the metal box. It moved with a soft, scraping sound. She looked inside. She expected to see gold or a lot of money. But the box was filled with paper. There were many old envelopes. They were white, but the edges were yellow from time. They were tied together with a piece of bright red string. On the top envelope, there was a name written in beautiful, flowing letters. The name was Elena. Below the letters, there was a small, black object. It was a digital memory stick. It looked modern and out of place next to the old paper. Sarah realized that this was the dangerous secret Julian Vane mentioned. The letters were the history, but the memory stick was the proof. Suddenly, she heard the boots again. The guard was coming back. Sarah acted quickly. She pulled the red string and put the stack of letters into her large bag. She grabbed the memory stick and pushed it into her pocket. She closed the lid of the metal box just as the guard entered the room. He handed her the passport. "Everything is fine," he said. But his eyes were still sharp and suspicious. "The manager says you must finish now. We have other customers waiting." "I am finished," Sarah said. She picked up her bag. She felt the weight of the letters against her side. She walked past the guard and out of the vault. She did not look back. She only wanted to get to Mark's car and leave this cold building. Sarah walked out of the central bank. The morning sunlight was very bright. It hurt her eyes for a moment. She walked quickly down the white stone steps, her hand gripping the strap of her bag. She did not look at the many people passing by. She only looked for the silver car. She saw it parked across the busy street. Mark was behind the wheel. He saw her and immediately started the engine. Sarah opened the car door and jumped in. "Go, Mark. Just drive," she said, her voice full of urgency. Mark did not ask any questions. He pulled away from the sidewalk and entered the morning traffic. He drove through 3 different streets and turned several corners to make sure no one was following them. Finally, he spoke. "Did you find it? Did you find what Julian was hiding?" Sarah reached into her bag. She pulled out the stack of letters tied with the red string. "I found these," she said. She then opened her other hand to show the small, black memory stick. "And I found this." Mark's eyes widened as he looked at the small plastic device. A memory stick. That is where the digital files are. That is likely the technical proof Julian was working on. But those letters, they look very old and personal. Sarah looked at the first envelope. The handwriting was soft and elegant, written with a fountain pen. The name on the front is Elena. "Do you know who she is?" Mark shook his head. "I never heard that name in any of the news reports or the police files I saw. Everyone in the city thought Julian Vane lived a very quiet, lonely life. No one knew he had anyone close to him." Sarah carefully untied the red string. The letters smelled like old flowers and dusty paper. She opened the top letter. It was dated 5 years ago. "Dear Julian." Sarah read quietly. "The people from the company are coming again. They are asking questions about your research. I am afraid. They are watching the house by the lake. Please be careful. I love you. Elena." The house by the lake. Mark whispered. "That must be the house in Oak Haven. The one on the map you found in the suitcase. These are love letters, Mark," Sarah said. She felt a heavy sadness in her heart. "But they are also warnings." Elena knew about the danger long before Julian disappeared. She was trying to protect him from the people who wanted his secrets. Sarah looked out the car window. The tall, glass buildings of the city felt like they were closing in on them. Who is Elena? And where is she now? Is she safe? Mark looked ahead at the road. His expression was very serious. If Julian is missing, maybe Elena is in danger too. Or maybe she is the person waiting for us at the lake house. We have to find out. We need a computer, Sarah said. She held the memory stick tightly. We need to see what is on this. It might be the only way to stop the man in the dark coat. Mark nodded. I know a small, quiet library on the way out of the city. We can stop there. We need to know the truth before we reach Oak Haven. The library was a small, square building made of red bricks. It sat on a quiet street far away from the noisy center of the city. Inside, the air was warm and still. There were only a few people sitting at long wooden tables. Sarah and Mark found a table in the back, hidden behind a tall shelf of old history books. Sarah took the stack of letters out of her bag. She carefully placed them on the table. The red string was now loose. She picked up the second letter. It was written on thick, cream-colored paper. The date was from 3 years ago. Listen to this, Mark, Sarah whispered. She began to read the letter aloud. Julian, I am so proud of your work. But you must be careful. You told me that the new energy cells are not stable. If the company sells them, people will be in danger. Why do they want to hide the truth? Please, come to the lake house. We can hide there together. Mark leaned closer. The secret is about safety, he said. Julian found a mistake in the technology. The company knew about it, but they wanted the money. They did not want to fix the problem. Sarah opened a third letter. This one was shorter. The handwriting looked messy, as if Elena was in a hurry. Julian, They found out about the memory stick. They know you have the data. A man in a dark coat came to the village today. He was asking for you. He had a cold face and dark eyes. I am leaving the house now. I will hide the blue suitcase where we planned. I love you always. The man in the dark coat. Sarah said. Her voice was shaking. He has been looking for Julian for years. He is not just a thief. He works for the company. Sarah felt a deep sadness for Julian and Elena. They were two people who loved each other, but they were caught in a dangerous web of lies. Julian was not just an engineer. He was a hero who wanted to protect people. Elena was his partner, and she was just as brave as he was. These letters are more than just words, Sarah said. She looked at the beautiful handwriting. They are the story of why Julian disappeared. He was trying to bring the truth to the world, and they tried to stop him. Mark looked at the memory stick on the table. This stick probably has the data Elena mentioned, the proof of the unstable energy cells. If we can show this to the world, Julian and Elena will be safe. The company will lose its power. Sarah touched the gold watch in her bag. The ticking sound was still there, steady and strong. It felt like Julian's heart was still beating, waiting for someone to help him. We have to go to Oak Haven, Sarah said firmly. Elena might still be there, or she might have left another clue. We know the secret now. Now, we need to find the people. Mark nodded and stood up. He packed his things quickly. The sun is starting to go down. We should reach the lake house by night. Let's go. Sarah. The truth is waiting for us in the woods. The silver car climbed higher into the mountains. The city was now a distant glow on the horizon, a cluster of artificial stars. Around them, the world grew thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. The road to Oak Haven was narrow and winding, a ribbon of black asphalt disappearing into the dark forest. Mark drove with a steady hand, but his eyes constantly flicked to the rearview mirror. Still nothing. He muttered, "Maybe we lost them at the library." "I hope so," Sarah replied, clutching the memory stick in her hand. "Mark, what exactly was Julian working on? These letters mention unstable cells. Is that a bomb?" "Not a bomb, but close if misused," Mark explained, his voice low. Julian was an expert in high-density energy storage. He was designing a new type of battery cell that could power a whole house for a month. The problem was the chemical transition. According to his early notes, the energy release followed a specific heat dissipation formula. If the temperature rose too quickly during the phase change, the internal pressure would cause the casing to fracture. Instead of a clean power source, you'd have a thermal runaway. The company knew the safety threshold was too low, but they wanted to sell it anyway. They were willing to ignore the risks to be first in the market. Sarah looked at the diagram on the back of one of Julian's sketches. It looked so clean and simple on paper, but the reality was a dangerous secret. He wasn't just hiding an invention. She realized. He was hiding a warning. Suddenly, the car's headlights swept over a wooden sign. "Welcome to Oak Haven. Population 400. The town was tiny. A few closed shops, a dark gas station, and a small post office. Following the hand-drawn map Sarah had found in the suitcase, they turned off the main road and onto a gravel path. The sound of the car changed from a smooth hum to a loud crunching of stones. "The lake should be just beyond this ridge," Sarah said, her heart hammering against her ribs. As they crested the hill, the trees opened up. Below them lay a vast, dark lake, its surface as still as black glass. On the far shore, nestled deep within the shadows of the pines, sat a small wooden cabin. A single, dim light was burning in the upstairs window. "Someone is there," Mark whispered, slowing the car to a crawl. Someone is waiting. Sarah felt the gold watch in her purse. It was still ticking, a tiny, metallic heartbeat in the silence of the woods. Was it Elena? Or was it a trap set by the man in the dark coat? They were miles from help, surrounded by the deep silence of the wilderness. "We have to go in," Sarah said, her voice filled with a sudden, sharp clarity. "We've come too far to turn back now." Mark nodded and turned off the car's headlights. They rolled forward in the silver moonlight, approaching the house by the lake. The gravel path ended abruptly, and the silver car came to a stop under the heavy canopy of a weeping willow. Mark turned off the engine. The sudden silence of the forest was almost loud. Sarah gripped the handle of the blue suitcase. She could feel the hard shape of the memory stick in her pocket, a small piece of plastic that held the power to change everything. They walked toward the cabin. The wood was dark and weathered, smelling of pine resin and old rain. The single light in the upstairs window flickered slightly, casting a long, thin shadow across the porch. As they reached the steps, Sarah noticed something. On the wooden railing, someone had carved a small bird, exactly like the one on the back of the gold pocket watch. "It's here," she whispered. "This is Julian's sanctuary." Mark stepped onto the porch first. The wood groaned under his weight. He reached for the heavy iron handle of the door, but before his fingers could touch it, the door swung open with a soft, smooth motion. A woman stood in the entryway. She was thin, with long hair the color of autumn leaves, now streaked with silver. Her eyes were sharp and filled with a mixture of terror and hope. She held a heavy brass candlestick in one hand, her knuckles white from the grip. "Who are you?" she asked. Her voice was steady, but it carried the weight of years of hiding. "My name is Sarah Miller," Sarah said, stepping forward into the dim light of the hallway. "And this is Mark. We found the suitcase. In the hotel blue." The woman's breath hitched. She lowered the candlestick slowly. Her eyes fell upon the blue suitcase in Sarah's hand. "The blue bag," she whispered. "He said someone would find it. He said if the world was still fair, the right person would find it." "Are you Elena?" Sarah asked. The woman nodded slowly. She stepped back, inviting them into a room filled with books, maps, and strange mechanical parts. In the center of the room was a large workbench covered in complex diagrams of the energy cells. One large blueprint was pinned to the wall, showing the internal pressure valves Julian had tried to perfect. "Where is Julian?" Mark asked, looking around the quiet house. Elena's face darkened. She walked over to the workbench and touched a small, half-finished metal cylinder. "He had to leave. 2 days ago, the man in the dark coat found our trail. Julian knew that if they captured both of us, the truth would die. He took the prototype and went deeper into the mountains, to the old mine." She turned to Sarah, her eyes pleading. "He left the data with the suitcase because he didn't want to carry it. He knew they would search him if they caught him. Did you bring the memory stick? The one with the stability calculations?" "I have it," Sarah said, pulling it from her pocket. "Thank God." Elena breathed. "Without those files, the company can claim the thermal runaway was just a fluke, a one-time accident. It's a fundamental flaw they tried to hide with cheap materials." Suddenly, a loud, sharp sound echoed from the woods outside, the sound of a car door slamming. A second later, bright white headlights swept across the cabin walls, cutting through the darkness like knives. "They are here," Elena whispered, her face turning pale. "The man in the dark coat. He didn't follow you. He followed the tracker Julian feared was in the watch." The blinding white light filled the room, turning the cozy cabin into a stage of sharp shadows. Sarah felt the adrenaline spike, that cold, electric hum in her veins. Elena didn't panic. She moved with the practiced grace of someone who had rehearsed this nightmare 1,000 times. "The back door is useless," Elena hissed, grabbing Sarah's arm. "They'll have the perimeter covered. We go down." She kicked aside a faded rug near the workbench, revealing a heavy wooden trapdoor. "Mark, help me with the latch." As Mark struggled with the rusted iron ring, a loud, methodical thud echoed from the front porch. It wasn't a frantic beat. It was the sound of someone who knew there was no escape. "Sarah Miller." A voice called out from behind the door. It was the same deep, wind-chilled voice from the phone. "You've been a very clever girl. But Julian's work belongs to the people who paid for it. Bring the suitcase and the drive out, and your friend Mark might actually live to write his story." "Don't listen to him," Elena whispered as the trapdoor finally creaked open. "He's the fixer for Nova Energy. His name is Vane's Shadow, but we call him the Collector." They scrambled down a narrow ladder into a cramped, dirt-smelling cellar. Above them, they heard the front door splinter. The Collector was inside. The hidden path. The cellar wasn't just for storage. Elena led them to a low tunnel reinforced with old timber. "This leads to the boathouse," she explained, her voice trembling. "Julian built it last summer. He knew the thermal runaway in the cells wasn't just a glitch, it was a cascade. If those batteries are integrated into the city grid." Mark panted as they crawled through the dark. One spike in temperature could trigger a chain reaction. The pressure would exceed the hull's integrity, and we'd see a disaster on a municipal scale. They emerged into the cool, damp air of the boathouse. A small, silent electric boat sat in the water. The plan: cross the lake to the old mine entrance. The risk: the Collector likely has infrared tech. The goal: find Julian and upload the data from a secure line. Suddenly, a red laser dot appeared on the wooden beam next to Sarah's head. She froze. Through the slats of the boathouse, she saw the man in the dark coat standing on the pier. He wasn't even aiming a gun. He was holding a remote device. "The watch. Sarah." The Collector called out, his voice amplified by the water. "The gold watch isn't just a tracker. It's a trigger. If you don't step out in 10 seconds, I'll initiate the discharge in the suitcase." Sarah looked at the blue suitcase. A faint, high-pitched whine began to emanate from the lining. The suitcase was getting warm. The air in the small boathouse was becoming dangerously warm. The high-pitched whine from the suitcase grew louder, a mechanical scream that set Sarah's teeth on edge. She looked down at her bag. The gold pocket watch was glowing with a faint, pulsing blue light behind its cracked glass face. "He's not lying," Elena breathed, her eyes wide with technical realization. The watch isn't just a timepiece. It's a remote induction trigger. It's feeding a wireless current into the suitcase's internal lining to jumpstart a thermal runaway. Mark stepped back, shielding his face. "Can we throw it in the lake?" "No," Elena shouted over the whine. The sudden change in temperature would cause the casing to contract while the internal pressure is rising. It would explode instantly. "We have to stabilize the reaction rate." 5 seconds. "Sarah." The Collector's voice boomed from the pier. 4. 3. Sarah didn't wait for one. She didn't throw the suitcase. Instead, she grabbed the gold watch. Remembering the code Mark had found, 721XB, she noticed the small dial on the side. It wasn't just for setting the time. She pulled the dial out and twisted it to the 7th notch, then back 2, then forward 1. On the letter X, she felt a mechanical click. The blue glow in the watch faded instantly. The high-pitched whine from the suitcase died down to a low hum, and the heat began to dissipate. The X wasn't just a letter. It was the cancel variable in Julian's security sequence. "Move." Now! Mark yelled. He shoved the electric boat into the water. Elena jumped into the pilot's seat, and Sarah scrambled in, clutching the now cool suitcase. The motor hummed silently, a gift of Julian's engineering, as they glided out of the boathouse and into the thick fog of the lake. Behind them, a flash of orange fire erupted. The collector, realizing his trigger had been bypassed, had thrown a flare into the boathouse. The old wood caught fire instantly, turning their only exit into a wall of flame. He's going to use the road to get to the other side, Elena said, her face illuminated by the distant fire. We have to reach the mine before he circles the lake. That's where Julian is. That's where the final prototype is hidden. Sarah looked back at the burning cabin. Everything she had known a few days ago was gone. She was on a dark lake, in a silent boat, carrying a secret that could save or destroy a city. We aren't just running anymore, Sarah realized, looking at Mark and Elena. We're fighting back. The electric boat touched the gravel shore with a soft crunch. The fog here was thicker, smelling of wet stone and old moss. Towering above them was the jagged silhouette of Iron Ridge. Elena led the way, navigating by memory through the dense pines until they reached a gaping black hole in the mountainside. The Silver Vein Mine. Elena whispered. It's been closed for 50 years, but the deep shafts are thermally stable. It was the only place Julian could keep the prototype cool enough for the final tests. They stepped into the darkness. Mark clicked on a heavy-duty flashlight, the beam cutting through the damp air. The walls were reinforced with rotting timber and rusted iron bolts. As they moved deeper, the temperature dropped sharply. The final laboratory. After 10 minutes of walking through the narrow tunnels, the path opened into a wide cavern. In the center stood a makeshift workstation powered by a humming portable generator. There were monitors, liquid nitrogen tanks, and a large, silver cylinder that looked like a futuristic jet engine. A man stood by the cylinder, his back to them. He was thin, and his shoulders were hunched with exhaustion. When he heard their footsteps, he spun around, holding a heavy wrench. Julian! Elena cried out. The man dropped the wrench. It hit the stone floor with a loud, heavy sound. Elena! How did you? His eyes moved to Sarah and Mark, then to the blue suitcase Sarah was still carrying. The suitcase. You found it. Sarah found it. Julian. Elena said, rushing to him. She's the one who brought the data. Julian Vane looked at Sarah with a mixture of awe and profound relief. He looked exactly like his photo, but older and much more tired. Then there's a chance, he rasped. The prototype is stable, but I couldn't prove the long-term safety without the calculations on that drive. The stability constant was missing from my local files. He quickly grabbed the memory stick from Sarah and plugged it into his terminal. The screens came to life, scrolling through thousands of lines of code. Julian pointed to a graph showing a pressure curve. Look, he said. The company's model assumed a linear pressure increase, but the real data shows an exponential jump at the critical phase transition. With your data, I can program the internal cooling shunts to trigger before the jump occurs. It makes the technology 100% safe. Can we send the data now? Mark asked, looking back at the tunnel entrance. The collector is right behind us. The stone is too thick for a signal, Julian said, his face hardening. But there's an old radio mast at the top of the ventilation shaft. If we can get a transmitter up there, we can broadcast the entire file to every news agency in the country. If we do that, Sarah said, there's no going back. Nova Energy will be ruined. That's the point, Julian replied. Suddenly, the sound of a distant explosion rocked the cavern. Dust fell from the ceiling. A cold, familiar voice echoed through the tunnels. amplified by the stone walls. "Julian, I know you're in there. You have 3 minutes to bring out the drive, or I drop the main support pillars. You can die for your truth, or you can live for your silence." The cavern air grew thick with dust as the first support pillar groaned. Julian didn't flinch. He grabbed a heavy metal case from under the workbench, a portable long-range transmitter. "The ventilation shaft is at the back of the chamber." He shouted over the rumbling. "Mark, I need you to boost the signal gain. Sarah, keep that memory stick ready." They scrambled toward a vertical shaft that pierced through the ceiling of the mine, stretching hundreds of feet toward the mountain peak. A rusted ladder clung to the side. Above them, a faint circle of moonlight marked the exit. "The antenna is already mounted at the top," Julian explained, his fingers flying across the transmitter's keys. "We just need to bridge the connection. But it takes time to encrypt the packet. If the collector cuts the power, we lose everything." The upload sequence. Julian hooked the memory stick into the transmitter. On the small orange screen, a progress bar appeared. 0%. Transmitting. Step 1. Establish handshake with the satellite relay. Step 2. Bypass the Nova energy firewall. Step 3. Broadcast to the global press network. The signal strength is fluctuating. Mark noted, looking at the waveform on the monitor. The rock is interfering with the decibel levels. "We need to increase the power." Julian muttered, "Sarah, hold this cable. If it slips, the connection breaks." Suddenly, the cavern went silent. The rumbling stopped. Then, a slow, rhythmic clapping echoed from the tunnel they had just left. The collector stepped into the light of the portable generator. He wasn't wearing his hat now. His hair was cropped short, and his eyes were as cold as the mountain stone. He held a detonator in one hand and a silenced pistol in the other. "Touching," the collector said. The genius, the wife, the journalist, and the girl who just wanted a hotel room. A perfect little tragedy. "It's over," Sarah said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the gun pointed at them. "The data is already moving." The collector glanced at the screen. 64%. A thin smile touched his lips. "Is it? The satellite hasn't received the header yet. I can end this now, and Nova Energy will simply say a tragic gas leak claimed 4 lives in an old mine." "You don't understand," Julian said, stepping in front of Sarah. "The data isn't just about the batteries anymore. It includes the surveillance logs of every person you've fixed for the company. Your name is at the top of the list." The collector's smile vanished. For the first time, Sarah saw a flicker of doubt in those dark eyes. He looked at the screen. 88%. He raised the pistol, aiming directly at the transmitter. "Last chance. Vane. Shut it down." "Sarah, hit the red toggle," Julian yelled. Sarah didn't hesitate. She slammed her hand onto the manual override. The screen flashed bright green. Upload complete. At that exact moment, every phone in the city, every newsroom in the country, and the collector's own tablet chimed simultaneously. The truth was no longer a secret in a blue suitcase. It was everywhere. The collector froze. The power he served was gone. He looked at the detonator in his hand, then at the 4 people standing defiantly in the dark. He knew that killing them now wouldn't hide the truth. It would only prove it. With a look of pure, cold hatred, he lowered the gun. "You've destroyed $1 billion industry." The collector whispered, "The world won't be as grateful as you think." "Maybe not," Sarah said, stepping forward. "But at least it will be safe." The silence that followed the upload was heavier than the explosion. The green light on the transmitter blinked steadily, a tiny beacon of truth in the dark belly of the mountain. The collector stood motionless, his shadow stretched long and thin across the cavern floor. For a moment, Sarah thought he might pull the trigger anyway, a final act of spite. Instead, he reached into his coat, not for his gun, but for a small, vibrating device. He looked at the screen, his jaw tightening as the headlines began to populate the global news feeds. "You've made a very expensive mistake, Miss Miller," he said, his voice devoid of the earlier theatricality. It was flat, professional, and somehow more terrifying. He didn't look at Julian or Mark. He kept his eyes fixed on Sarah, as if she were the only variable he hadn't calculated. "Nova Energy is a hydra. You've cut off one head. Do you have any idea how many are left?" Without waiting for an answer, he stepped back into the shadows of the secondary tunnel. "Don't bother following me," he called out, his voice fading. "The local authorities are already at the mine entrance. They'll want their heroes, and I've never been fond of the spotlight." A moment later, the sound of a distant engine echoed through the shafts, a high-powered motorcycle. By the sound of it, he was gone. Julian slumped against the cooling cylinder of the prototype. The adrenaline that had kept the 45-year-old engineer standing seemed to evaporate, leaving behind a man who looked like he had aged a decade in a single night. Elena was at his side instantly, her hands trembling as she wiped the dust from his forehead. "Is it really over?" she whispered. Mark was already on his phone, the blue light illuminating a face twisted in a grin. "Over. Elena, the internet is melting. The stock price for Nova Energy just dropped 40% in 10 minutes. Every major news outlet has the stability data. They're calling it the vein files. Julian, you're the most famous man on the planet right now." Sarah walked over to the blue suitcase, which was sitting near the transmitter. She felt a strange detachment from the excitement. She had come to the city for a fresh start, a simple job, and a quiet life. Instead, she had spent the last 48 hours running through rain-slicked alleys and dodging assassins. She picked up the bag. It felt lighter now, though its contents hadn't changed. "We need to get out of here," Sarah said, looking toward the main entrance where the faint sound of sirens was finally beginning to penetrate the rock. "The police will have 1,000 questions, and I don't think I have the breath left to answer them." "She's right," Mark said, tucking his phone away. "The media will be right behind the police. If we want to control the narrative, we need to move. Julian, can you walk?" Julian nodded, leaning on Elena, as they began the long trek back to the surface. Sarah looked back at the cavern one last time. The transmitter was still there, a silent sentinel of the truth. She realized then that while the data was out, the suitcase had started this journey, and something told her the suitcase wasn't finished with her yet. The sun was high in the sky by the time Sarah, Mark, Julian, and Elena were released from the local precinct in Oak Haven. The small town had been transformed into a circus of satellite trucks and shouting reporters. Because Mark was a journalist himself, he had managed to negotiate a quiet exit through the back of the station, leading them to a safe house he knew on the outskirts of the woods. It was a small, unassuming cottage with peeling white paint and a porch that smelled of honeysuckle. For the first time in what felt like years, Julian and Elena sat down at a table together, drinking tea and watching the news. "The CEO of Nova Energy has resigned," Mark announced, scrolling through his laptop. "The board of directors is claiming they had no knowledge of the stability issues. They're trying to blame Julian, saying he misinterpreted the data and went rogue." Julian let out a dry, hollow laugh. "Of course they are. They'll bury the truth in legal paperwork for years. But they can't stop the physics. The data shows the heat flux in their current cells is nonlinear. No lawyer can argue with a thermodynamic reality." Sarah sat on the windowsill, looking out at the peaceful forest. She should have been happy. The bad guys were being exposed, and her new friends were safe. But she couldn't shake the memory of the collector's eyes. He hadn't looked like a man who had lost. He looked like a man who was moving to phase 2. Sarah. Elena walked over, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. You've been very quiet. You saved our lives. Without you, that suitcase would still be under a bed in a hotel that wanted us dead. I was just thinking about the suitcase. Sarah admitted. Julian, why that bag? It's so specific. The blue silk, the hidden compartments. It feels like it was designed for more than just carrying a notebook. Julian's expression turned thoughtful. He set his tea down. You're very observant. Sarah, that suitcase was a gift. It was made by a man named Arthur Vance. No relation to me. He was a master craftsman who worked for the government during the Cold War. He specialized in secure transport. He made 3 of them. Mark looked up from his laptop, his journalistic instincts tingling. 3. You mean there are 2 more blue suitcases out there? Not blue. Julian corrected. One was crimson red. The other was a deep, forest yellow. Each was given to a lead engineer on the original energy project. We were a team of 3. I had the stability data. Marcus Thorne had the chemical composition. And Dr. Aries Thorne, his brother, had the manufacturing schematics. Sarah felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. And where are Marcus and Aries? Julian looked at the floor, his voice dropping to a whisper. Marcus died in a car accident 3 months ago. Aries has been missing for a year. I thought I was the last one left. I thought my suitcase was the only one that mattered. Sarah looked at her blue suitcase sitting by the door. If Nova Energy wants the technology, they don't just need your data. They need the chemicals and the schematics. They need all 3 bags. The revelation of the other suitcases changed the atmosphere in the cottage instantly. The victory in the mine suddenly felt like only a partial success. If Julian's data proved the technology was dangerous, the other 2 suitcases likely contain the secrets of how to make it, or how to fix it. If the collector is still out there. Sarah said, standing up. He isn't just running away. He's going after the other bags. Or he already has them. He doesn't have the crimson one. Julian said firmly. Marcus was paranoid. Even more than me. He told me once that if anything ever happened to him, his legacy would be returned to the place where it all started. A place called the Foundry. The Foundry? Mark asked. Is that a factory? It was an old research station in the industrial district of the city. Julian explained. It's been abandoned for years. But Marcus used to keep a workshop there. He loved the smell of iron and old grease. He said the modern labs felt too sterile. Sarah felt a surge of determination. She couldn't sit in this cottage while the mystery remained unsolved. Mark. We have to go back to the city. If the collector knows about the foundry, he's probably already on his way. Sarah. It's too dangerous. Elena pleaded. The police are looking for you to give a formal statement. The media wants to put your face on every screen. You can't just walk into an abandoned factory. I'm the only one who knows how to find the hidden compartments. Sarah pointed out, gesturing to the blue suitcase. Julian, you said these bags were made by the same man. They likely have the same locking mechanisms. If Marcus hid his suitcase, it's going to be behind a wall or under a floorboard that only someone who knows the Vance style can find. Mark stood up, grabbing his car keys. She's right. And if I'm there, I can document it. If we find the second suitcase, Nova Energy won't just be facing a scandal. They'll be facing a total collapse. We can prove they stole the tech from murdered men. Julian reached into his pocket and pulled out the gold pocket watch. The glass was still cracked, but the hands were moving perfectly. He handed it to Sarah. "The watch is a multi-tool," Julian said. "You saw how the code bypassed the trigger. But there's another function. If you hold the dial down and move it toward the 12, the hands will act as a compass for the Vance suitcases. They're lined with a specific magnetic alloy. If you get within 50 meters of the crimson or yellow bags, the watch will start to hum." Sarah took the watch. It felt warm in her palm. "We'll be careful, Julian. I promise." "One more thing," Julian added, his eyes dark with warning. Marcus Thorne wasn't just an engineer. He was a chemist. He didn't just deal with heat. He dealt with reactions. If that crimson suitcase is tampered with by the wrong hands, it won't just get warm. It will release a gas that can put a whole block to sleep. Or worse. Be gentle with it. Sarah nodded, tucked the watch into her pocket, and looked at Mark. "Let's go. We have a city to return to." As they drove away from Oak Haven, Sarah looked at the blue suitcase in the backseat. It seemed to watch her, a silent partner in a game that was growing larger by the hour. The city awaited them, and somewhere in its iron heart, a crimson secret was waiting to be found. The city felt different as Sarah and Mark drove back across the bridge. The skyline, once a symbol of opportunity and a fresh start, now looked like a jagged row of teeth. The news of the Vane files had turned the metropolis into a beehive. Police cruisers were everywhere, and digital billboards that usually flashed advertisements for expensive watches were now displaying Julian Vane's face and the headline, "Nova Energy Cover-Up Exposed. We can't go through the main streets," Mark said, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror. "Every news crew in the country knows my silver sedan by now. We're the accomplices or the heroes, depending on which channel you watch. Either way, we're targets." He steered the car away from the Glass and Steel Center and toward the South District. This was the city's old shadow, a place of rusting iron, crumbling brick, and long silent chimneys. This was where the Industrial Revolution had breathed its last, leaving behind a graveyard of warehouses. This was the home of the foundry. They parked 3 blocks away in a weed-choked lot behind a collapsed brewery. The air here was thick with the smell of damp concrete and ancient soot. Sarah felt the gold watch in her pocket. As she stepped out of the car, she pulled it out. Following Julian's instructions, she pressed the dial and turned it toward the 12. A faint, rhythmic vibration pulsed against her thumb. The hands of the watch, which usually moved with the steady ticking of time, suddenly jerked to the left. They didn't point toward north. They pointed toward a massive, windowless structure at the end of the street. "It's working," Sarah whispered. "The crimson bag is close." The foundry was a cathedral of rust. Its corrugated metal walls were covered in layers of graffiti and grime. The main gates were locked with a heavy chain, but the links had been cut recently. Mark pointed to the ground. In the soft, oily dirt, there were fresh footprints, heavy boots, spaced wide apart. "The collector," Mark muttered. He didn't waste any time. They slipped through the gap in the gates. Inside, the light was filtered through thousands of holes in the roof, creating long, dusty beams that looked like solid pillars. The sound of their footsteps echoed off the high rafters. Huge, dormant machines, presses, lathes, and furnaces loomed in the dark like sleeping giants. Sarah held the watch out. The vibration was getting stronger. The needle was spinning now, frantic and hungry. "This way," she said, leading Mark toward a smaller office structure built into the side of the main hall. The door to the office had been kicked in. Inside, files were scattered like snow. A desk had been overturned, and the floorboards had been ripped up in several places. Someone had searched this room with a violent desperation. "He was here," Mark said. checking a closet. But did he find it? Sarah walked to the center of the room. She closed her eyes and tried to think like Arthur Vance, the master craftsman. Julian had said the bags were hidden in places where they started. She looked at a large, rusted iron safe in the corner. Its door was wide open, completely empty. The collector had clearly checked the obvious spots. She looked up. Hanging from the ceiling was an old iron hook used for moving heavy engine parts. It looked ordinary, but it was positioned directly over a specific tile on the floor that bore a faint, circular scratch. "Mark, help me swing that hook," Sarah said. Together, they pulled the heavy iron chain. As the hook moved over the circular scratch, a soft clack sounded from inside the wall. A small panel, disguised as a rusted fuse box, popped open. Inside the dark cavity, resting on a bed of velvet that had long since turned to dust, sat the second suitcase. It was a deep, bruised crimson, its leather glowing with a sinister beauty in the dim light. The crimson bag. Mark breathed. Sarah reached for it, but she stopped. She remembered Julian's warning. It won't just get warm. It will release a gas. She looked at the lock. It wasn't a gold latch like the blue bag. It was a chemical dial, with small glass vials embedded in the frame. One wrong move, and the foundry would become their tomb. Sarah stared at the crimson suitcase, her breath hitching in the cold, stagnant air of the office. Unlike the blue suitcase, which had felt like a puzzle for a thief, this one felt like a weapon for a chemist. The lock was a complex array of 3 glass vials, each filled with a different colored liquid, one a vibrant cerulean, one clear, and one a dark, oily amber. They were connected to a series of pressure sensors and a central dial. "Don't touch it yet," Mark whispered, his flashlight beam trembling. "Julian said it releases gas. If those vials break or the pressures mix, we're dead before we hit the floor." Sarah leaned in, noticing a small inscription etched into the metal frame of the lock. It wasn't a name or a date, but a chemical ratio. She recognized the symbols from her college chemistry elective. But here, they were a death warrant. The inscription read, "It's a buffer system." Sarah realized, her mind racing. The liquids in the vials are precursors. If the equilibrium shifts too quickly, it triggers an exothermic reaction. She remembered Julian's notes on the energy cells. The stability of the chemical composition was governed by the rate of reaction. Specifically, she pulled the gold watch from her pocket. The hands were vibrating so intensely now that they were a blur. She noticed that the back of the watch had a secondary set of markings she hadn't seen before, small, color dots that matched the liquids in the vials. "The watch is the key," Sarah said. "It's a titration guide." She carefully aligned the watch with the dial. Using the minute hand as a lever, she began to rotate the lock. She moved it 2 millimeters to the left, watching the cerulean liquid bubble. Then, a slow turn to the right. Mark wiped sweat from his brow. "Sarah, I hear something. Outside. Like a drone. Just hold the light steady," Sarah urged. Her fingers were slick with cold sweat. She made the final turn, a delicate half rotation that forced the amber liquid into the central chamber. For a heartbeat, there was a low, angry hiss. A puff of white vapor escaped from the side of the bag, smelling faintly of almonds. Then, a satisfying click echoed through the room. The vials drained into a hidden reservoir, and the latches of the crimson suitcase popped open. Sarah let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. She slowly lifted the lid. Inside, tucked into slots of protective foam, were dozens of small glass slides and a thick, leather-bound journal. "The chemical composition," Mark said, leaning over. "This is the recipe for the unstable cells. It's not just data, it's the exact molecular structure." But as Sarah reached for the journal, a sharp, red light swept across the room from the window. The drone Mark had heard wasn't just patrolling. It had found them. A mechanical voice crackled through a speaker somewhere outside. Unauthorized recovery detected. Initiate containment. The red light from the drone pulsed against the rusted walls like a heartbeat. Mark grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her down behind the heavy iron desk just as a projectile shattered the office window. It wasn't a bullet, but a small, metallic sphere that began to hiss, releasing a thick, purple fog. Gas! Mark yelled, tearing a piece of his shirt off to cover his face. Sarah, we have to go. Sarah grabbed the leather-bound journal and the glass slides, shoving them into the crimson suitcase. She slammed the lid shut. The chemical lock reset automatically with a sharp snap. The back stairs. She shouted, pointing toward a narrow iron spiral staircase that led toward the foundry's rafters. They scrambled up the stairs, the purple fog rising beneath them like an incoming tide. The air was becoming difficult to breathe, stinging Sarah's lungs. As they reached the high catwalks, Sarah looked down. Through the haze, she saw a figure moving with unnatural speed and precision. It wasn't the collector. It was a machine, a quadrupedal security robot, its sensors glowing a lethal crimson. Nova Energy didn't just send men. Mark panted as they ran across the vibrating metal walkway. They sent the prototypes. That thing is powered by the very cells we're trying to expose. Then it has a weakness, Sarah said, her eyes searching the rafters. She looked at the heavy industrial magnets hanging from the ceiling, used for moving scrap metal. Mark, the energy cells. Julian said they rely on a specific magnetic flux to keep the iron stable. If we can disrupt the field, we can short-circuit its power source. If we can drop one of those electromagnets near it. Sarah explained. The magnetic field $B will be so strong it will force the ions in the battery to deviate from their path, causing a total system shutdown. Mark saw a control panel at the end of the catwalk. I'll get the magnet. You lead it to the kill zone. Sarah didn't hesitate. She stood up on the catwalk, waving her arms. Hey! Over here, you bucket of bolts. The robot's head snapped up. It let out a high-pitched whine as it leaped onto the support pillar, climbing toward her with terrifying agility. Sarah backed away, leading it directly under the massive, dormant electromagnet. The robot crouched, preparing to spring. Its chest plate glowed as it drew power for the jump. Now! Mark! Sarah screamed. Mark slammed his fist onto the emergency load button. The electromagnet roared to life with a hum that shook the entire building. The robot was mid-air when the field hit it. It jerked violently, its internal lights flickering white, then blue, then dark. It crashed into the metal floor below, a heap of useless, sparking metal. Sarah collapsed against the railing, her heart hammering. One down. She whispered, but we still don't have the third bag. The silence that followed the robot's crash was even more unnerving than the chase. Sarah and Mark climbed down from the catwalks, avoiding the purple fog that was now settling into a low carpet on the floor. They reached the exit and burst out into the cool night air, leaning against each other as they hurried back to the car. Once inside the silver sedan, Sarah opened the crimson suitcase again. She pulled out the leather-bound journal. On the first page, there was a photograph of 3 men standing in front of a laboratory. Julian Vane was on the left, looking young and hopeful. In the middle was a man with sharp, intense eyes, Marcus Thorne, and on the right was a man who looked remarkably like Marcus, but with a softer, more scholarly expression. Aries Thorne, the 3 brothers in science. Mark said, looking at the photo. They were going to change the world. Sarah flipped through the journal. It was filled with Marcus's notes on the chemical stability of the cells. But near the back, the entries changed. The handwriting became shaky, frantic. "Mark, look at this," Sarah said. She pointed to a passage dated 1 year ago. "Aries is gone. They took him to the cloud." He whispered the location of the yellow bag to me before the black cars arrived. He said it's where the light meets the water, but not the lake. The salt water. The cloud. Mark frowned. That's what people call the high-rise district. It's the most expensive part of the city, where the skyscrapers are literally above the smog line. And the salt water means the ocean. Sarah added. The old lighthouse on the South Cape. Aries Thorne was the manufacturing expert, Sarah said, her voice growing more urgent. Julian had the data. Marcus had the chemicals. But Aries had the schematics for the containment shell. Without the shell, the other 2 bags are just a story about a disaster. The shell is the only thing that makes the technology work safely. She looked at the gold watch. It had stopped vibrating. The hands were moving normally again, but they seemed to be pointing toward the coast. If Aries was taken to the cloud, Mark said, it means he might still be alive. Nova Energy wouldn't kill the only man who knows how to build the casing. They need him. Then we're not just looking for a suitcase anymore. Sarah realized. We're looking for a prisoner. She thought about the math of the casing, the structural integrity required to hold the pressure they had seen in the mine. The stress on a cylindrical pressure vessel was defined by Julian's notes, which said the pressure was near infinite during a runaway. The material Aries designed must be a miracle of engineering, or something incredibly dangerous. To the lighthouse, Sarah said, before the collector realizes the robot failed. The drive to the South Cape took them along the winding coastal highway. To their left, the dark Atlantic Ocean crashed against the jagged rocks, sending plumes of white spray into the moonlight. The air here was sharp and salty, a stark contrast to the oily grime of the foundry. The lighthouse stood on a lonely finger of land, a white stone tower that looked like a ghost against the black sky. It hadn't been used in decades. Its light had been replaced by modern satellite navigation. But as they approached, Sarah saw a faint, rhythmic flash from the top. Not a steady beam, but a signal. Someone's up there. Mark whispered, parking the car behind a sand dune. They walked toward the tower, their feet sinking into the cold sand. The door at the base was heavy oak, reinforced with iron. Sarah reached for the handle, but she stopped when the gold watch in her pocket began to hum. Not a vibration, but a high-pitched, musical tone. The yellow bag. Sarah whispered, "It's inside." They entered the lighthouse. The air was damp and smelled of seaweed. A spiral stone staircase wound its way up into the darkness. As they climbed, Sarah felt a strange sense of peace. Unlike the hotel or the foundry, this place felt protected. On the 3rd floor, they found a small living area. It was filled with books on metallurgy and structural engineering. In the corner, sitting on a simple wooden chair, was the 3rd suitcase. It was a bright, sun-faded yellow, its surface scratched as if it had traveled 1,000 miles. But the suitcase wasn't alone. Sitting at a small table, lit by a single candle, was a man. He was thin, his hair completely white, and his eyes were covered by thick glasses. He was staring at a set of blueprints, a compass in his hand. "Aries?" Sarah asked softly. The man didn't look up. The thickness of the wall must be 5.2 millimeters. He muttered, "Any less, and the crystalline structure collapses under the ion load. Any more, and the weight prevents the cooling vents from opening." He finally looked at them, his eyes wide and unfocused. "Did Marcus send you? Is the cerulean liquid stable?" "Marcus is gone. Aries." Mark said gently, "We're friends of Julian. We have the blue and crimson bags." Aries stood up, his legs shaking. He looked at the 2 suitcases Sarah was carrying. A slow, sad smile spread across his face. Then the Trinity is complete. The data, the chemistry, and the shell. He reached for the yellow suitcase, but then his expression shifted to one of intense fear. He looked toward the window. You shouldn't have come here. The cloud. They don't just watch the towers. They watch the horizon. Far out at sea, a dark shape was approaching, a silent, black helicopter with no lights, skimming the surface of the water. The 3 suitcases sat on the scarred wooden table, their colors, blue, crimson, and yellow, forming a primary-colored triangle of secrets. In the flickering candlelight of the lighthouse, they looked less like luggage and more like the components of an ancient altar. Aries Thorne touched the yellow leather with a reverence that bordered on the religious. The blue is the mind. Aries whispered, his voice cracking. Julian's data. The crimson is the blood. Marcus's volatile chemistry. And the yellow is the skin. The containment shell. Without the skin, the blood boils and the mind shatters. He flicked the latches of the yellow bag. Inside, there were no journals or vials. Instead, there was a single, heavy cylinder made of a matte grey alloy that seemed to swallow the light. Beside it lay a set of precision calipers and a series of microscopic lenses. This is a crystalline titanium boron lattice. Aries explained, pointing to the cylinder. The molecular structure is arranged in a non-Euclidean geometry to counteract the localized gravitational warping caused by the ion density. If you want to hold the energy of a star in a box the size of a toaster, the walls have to be more than just strong. They have to be smart. He scribbled a formula on the edge of the blueprint. The strain on the lattice under maximum load is calculated by. It's a miracle, Mark said, leaning in. But it's a miracle they want to weaponize. The sound of the helicopter was no longer a distant hum. It was a rhythmic thumping that vibrated the glass in the lighthouse lantern above. The black silhouette blocked out the moon as it hovered 50 yards from the balcony. A spotlight cut through the darkness, blinding them. This is the Nova Security Division. A voice boomed over a megaphone. Relinquish the Thornvane assets and step away from the tower. You are in possession of proprietary corporate intelligence. They don't want the truth, Aries said, grabbing the yellow suitcase. They want the monopoly on the future. If they have this shell, they can sell the batteries without the safety filters. They'll trade lives for efficiency. We're not giving them anything, Sarah said, her voice hard. She grabbed the blue and crimson bags. Mark, the service lift. Julian said there was an old pulley for moving oil crates. They scrambled toward a small iron cage in the center of the tower. Aries shoved the yellow suitcase inside, followed by Sarah and Mark. As the helicopter began to deploy ropes for a tactical team, Mark pulled the manual release. The cage plummeted down the center of the spiral staircase, the wind whistling through the bars. They hit the ground floor with a bone-jarring thud just as the first boot hit the roof above. They burst out the side door, into the spray of the ocean. The silver sedan was waiting, but as they reached it, a second set of headlights appeared on the coastal road. The collector was not going to let the Trinity slip away twice. Mark threw the silver sedan into 5th gear, the engine screaming as they tore down the coastal highway. Behind them, the collector's black SUV was a predatory shadow, closing the gap with terrifying speed. Above, the helicopter's searchlight carved through the mist, pinning them to the asphalt like insects in a display case. In the back seat, Sarah sat wedged between Aries Thorne and the 3 suitcases. As the car swerved around a sharp bend, the bags shifted, touching each other for the first time. A low, harmonic hum began to vibrate through the floorboards. It wasn't the angry whine of the thermal trigger. It was a pure, resonant tone that felt like a physical weight in the air. They are sinking, Aries shouted over the wind. He grabbed the gold watch from Sarah's hand and pressed it against the yellow suitcase. The magnetic alloy in the linings. They're establishing a localized field. It's a fail-safe Julian and Marcus built. The resonance frequency. He pointed to the small screen on the yellow bag's lock. A series of wave patterns began to overlap. If we can lock the frequency, the suitcases will create a shielded loop. The collector won't be able to trigger a discharge, and more importantly, the data will be encrypted by the physical state of the chemicals. Mark, we need a straight line. Sarah yelled as a bullet shattered the rear window. I can't give you a straight line. Sarah. We're running out of road. Mark pulled the wheel hard to the left. Ahead lay the final junction, a massive interchange where the coastal highway split into the industrial port to the east and the high-speed rail terminal to the west. The collector's SUV rammed their back bumper, sending a bone-jarring shock through the car. Sarah looked back and saw the man in the dark coat through his windshield. He wasn't looking at the road. He was looking at the glowing suitcases. He knew the Trinity was active. He knew that if they reached the rail terminal, they could disappear into the morning commute of 10,000 people. The frequency is drifting. Aries cried, his hands blurring as he adjusted the dials on the crimson and yellow bags. I need the blue bag's interface. Sarah, the watch, turn the dial to the X position and hold it against the blue silk. Sarah reached for the blue suitcase. Her fingers brushed the silk, and she felt a tingle of static electricity. She jammed the watch into the corner. The hum deepened, turning into a sub-bass throb that made her vision vibrate. Locked. She screamed. At that moment, Mark slammed on the brakes. The silver sedan spun 180 degrees, tires smoking, and slid sideways through the junction toward the rail terminal entrance. The collector, caught off guard by the maneuver, veered right, his SUV clipping a concrete barrier and sending sparks flying into the night. Out! Out now! Mark commanded. They scrambled from the car, each grabbing a suitcase. The rail terminal loomed ahead, a cathedral of glass and steel. But as they reached the doors, a familiar, cold voice echoed through the plaza. The Trinity is incomplete without a witness. Sarah. The collector had exited his crashed vehicle. He was limping, his dark coat torn. But he held a small, silver remote. The terminal is rigged with Nova's signal jammers. Your broadcast is dead. Give me the bags, or I collapse the glass roof. The rail terminal was a vast expanse of white marble and soaring glass arches, a cathedral dedicated to the religion of speed and punctuality. At this pre-dawn hour, it was eerily empty. The only sound was the distant hum of the third rail power and the frantic breathing of the three fugitives. They stood in the center of the great hall, three suitcases huddled together at their feet like glowing embers. The collector stepped through the shattered glass of the entrance, the silver remote held high. Above them, the massive glass panels of the ceiling creaked in the wind. Nova Energy doesn't just build batteries. Mr. Thorne. The collector called out, his voice echoing off the marble. We build the systems that control the flow of everything. This terminal is a node. The jammers I've activated are broadcasting a high-frequency white noise that negates all cellular and satellite bands within a 1-mile radius. You are in a digital tomb. Aries looked up at the ceiling, then down at the suitcases. His eyes were wide, but no longer with fear. There was a manic calculation in his gaze. A digital tomb. No. It's a resonator. He knelt by the suitcases, his fingers flying across the touch-sensitive pads Julian and Marcus had hidden in the leather. Sarah. Mark, listen to me. Aries whispered. The jammers are using a standard phase shift keying to drown out signals. But the Trinity, it's powered by the prototype cells. We aren't just holding data. We are holding an active power source that operates on a quantum tunneling frequency. We can't broadcast through his noise. We have to use his noise as a carrier wave. Explain that in English. Ares. Mark shouted, glancing back at the collector, who was closing the distance, his pistol raised. It's constructive interference. Ares cried. If we sync the Trinity's output to the exact inverse of his jammer's frequency, we don't just cancel it out. We create a spike of power, a Dirac delta function, that will burn out every circuit in his remote and blast our signal straight to the orbital relays. The collector realized what Ares was doing. He stopped, his face contorting with rage. You think you can out-engineer a corporate blackout? Stop him. He fired a shot, the bullet sparking off the marble inches from Ares's hand. Sarah didn't think. She grabbed the metal luggage cart nearby and shoved it with all her strength toward the collector, forcing him to dive for cover behind a stone pillar. Do it, Ares. Now. The 3 suitcases began to pulse in unison. Blue, crimson, and yellow merging into a blinding, pure white light. The air in the terminal began to taste like ozone, and the hair on Sarah's arms stood on end. The glass cathedral was no longer a place of transit. It was the focal point of a scientific revolution. The white light from the Trinity filled the great hall, turning the shadows into sharp, jagged lines. The hum had grown into a roar, a physical force that vibrated in Sarah's marrow. She could see the collector through the glare, his silhouette struggling to stand against the sheer pressure of the electromagnetic field. He tried to aim his pistol, but the metal began to glow with induced current, forcing him to drop it with a cry of pain. The resonance is peaking. Ares shouted, his hair standing up in a wild white halo. The jammer is fighting back, but it's feeding the loop. It's like a forest fire consuming its own oxygen. The terminal's electronic display boards began to flicker and die, replaced by a single, scrolling line of green code. Thorn Protocol. Active. The signal strength was off the charts. Ares was right. By aligning the phase of the 3 suitcases, they had created a spectral signature so powerful it was physically warping the air. As the frequency $F$ hit the harmonic of the terminal's own glass structure, the ceiling began to sing. It was a beautiful, terrifying sound. The sound of 10,000 sheets of glass vibrating at their natural frequency. Ares, the roof. Mark yelled, shielding his head. If that glass shatters, we're finished. We only need 10 more seconds. Ares replied, his eyes fixed on the progress bar on the yellow suitcase. 60%. 70%. The data packets are being stripped and reassembled in the satellite's buffer. It's not just the safety files anymore, Mark. It's the entire patent library. We're making the technology open source. The collector lunged from behind the pillar, his face twisted in a mask of desperation. He didn't go for the gun. He went for the suitcases, a heavy combat knife in his hand. If he couldn't stop the signal, he would destroy the source. Sarah intercepted him. She swung her own heavy bag, the one containing the gold watch and Julian's notebooks, like a mace. It caught the collector in the ribs, sending him reeling. But he was fast. He grabbed Sarah's arm, his grip like iron. You don't understand. He hissed into her ear, the roar of the resonance drowning out everything else. Nova isn't a company. It's a foundation. You're destroying the only thing keeping the lights on in this city. Then we'll learn to live in the dark until we build something better. Sarah retorted, kneed him in the stomach, and shoved him away. 90%. Ares screamed. 95%. The glass roof above them gave a final, mournful groan. A single crack appeared, snaking across the central dome like a bolt of lightning. The white light reached a crescendo, a soundless explosion of pure information. The explosion wasn't made of fire, but of light and silence. For a heartbeat, the great hall of the rail terminal was the brightest place on Earth. Then, the hum vanished. The white light retracted into the 3 suitcases, leaving behind a smell of scorched air and a ringing in everyone's ears. The progress bar on the yellow bag read, 100%. Transmission complete. Worldwide distribution confirmed. The collector sat on the marble floor, his back against a pillar. He looked broken, the veins shadows stripped of his mystery. His remote was a melted hunk of plastic. His phone was dead. The multi-billion-dollar empire he served had just been dismantled by a girl with a hotel room key and 3 old men who refused to be forgotten. "It's done," Mark said, his voice shaky. He pulled out his own phone. The signal was back. He opened a news app. The headline was already there, flashing in red. Nova Energy patents released to public domain. CEO under arrest. Aries slumped over the suitcases, sobbing quietly. The weight of a year in hiding, the loss of his brothers, and the burden of the Trinity had finally broken. Sarah knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You did it, Aries. They're safe now. Marcus and Julian. The world knows the truth." The sound of boots echoed on the marble. Not the collector's boots, but the rhythmic, heavy tread of the city's tactical police. They poured into the terminal from every entrance, their flashlights cutting through the settling dust. Hands in the air. "Don't move," a voice commanded. Sarah looked at Mark. He smiled, a tired, lopsided grin. "This is the part where we become the heroes, I think." The collector looked up at Sarah. There was no more hatred in his eyes, only a cold, professional curiosity. "You think you won, Sarah Miller. But the technology is out there now. Thousands of people will try to build it. Some will succeed. Most will fail. The disasters you tried to prevent. They're just starting. You've given a candle to a world made of dry straw." "Maybe," Sarah said, standing tall as the officers approached. "But a candle is better than a shadow. At least now, people can see the fire coming." As the police moved in to arrest the collector and secure the suitcases, Sarah felt the gold watch in her pocket. It was still ticking. The hands were moving perfectly, marking the seconds of a new era. She looked at the blue suitcase, the bag that had started it all. It looked ordinary again, just a piece of luggage from a bygone age. "What now, Sarah?" Mark asked as an officer led them toward the exit. Sarah looked up at the cracked glass roof, where the first light of a real dawn was beginning to filter through. "Now," she said softly, "I think I'd like to find a hotel room that isn't a crime scene." The weeks following the Great Transmission were a blur of flashbulbs, sterile interrogation rooms, and the relentless hum of 24-hour news cycles. Sarah Miller, who had entered the city as a ghost seeking a new life, was now the face of the Thornvane Revolution. The 3 suitcases, blue, crimson, and yellow, were no longer hidden under beds or in rusted safes. They were evidence in what legal scholars were already calling the trial of the century. Nova Energy did not vanish overnight. Corporations of that size have deep roots. But the rot had been exposed. The CEO, a man named Sterling Vance, was under house arrest. The stability data Sarah and Mark had released forced a global recall of the NovaGen cells. Sarah sat in a quiet park, watching the city breathe. The air felt lighter. Or perhaps that was just her imagination. Mark sat beside her, his laptop closed for once. He had won the Pulitzer for his coverage, but he looked more tired than ever. "The government is trying to classify the technology," Mark said, leaning back. "They say it's for national security. They want to take the open source data and lock it behind a different kind of door." "They can't," Sarah replied. Aries ensured the encryption was decentralized. "It's like a digital dandelion. The seeds are everywhere now." The impact on the power grid was immediate. Independent labs across the globe were already reporting successful stabilizations using Julian's formulas. With the Trinity combined, the efficiency had jumped from a dangerous 65% to a stable 98.4%. The collector is still refusing to talk. Mark added. His lawyers are arguing that he was a private contractor, with no formal ties to Nova's illegal activities. They might not be able to pin the murders on him without a direct witness. Sarah felt the weight of the gold watch in her pocket. It was no longer a tracker or a trigger. It was just a beautiful piece of machinery. He knows I saw him. He knows I know who he is. That has to count for something. In this city. Mark sighed. Justice is a slow-moving train. Sarah. But at least we're on the tracks now. Sarah looked at her hands. They weren't shaking anymore. She had faced the shadow and the machine, and she was still standing. But as she watched a black sedan roll slowly past the park, she realized that the aftermath wasn't an end. It was a transition state, a phase change in the chemistry of her life. Julian Vane's recovery was slow, but the mountain air of Oak Haven, where he had returned under federal protection, was the best medicine. A month after the events at the rail terminal, Sarah and Mark made the trip back to the lake house. This time, there were no black cars following them, only the sound of the wind through the pines. When they arrived, they found Julian and Aries sitting on the porch. The two survivors of the original trio looked like ghosts who had finally found their way home. Elena was there, too, her face radiant. The Trinity was incomplete without Marcus, but the brothers had found a new piece. We've been looking at the manufacturing logs, Aries said, gesturing to a stack of papers. The government wants to build a central hub for the Thornvein cells. They've offered us consultant roles. Will you take them? Sarah asked. Julian shook his head. We've had enough of hubs and centers. Sarah, we're going to open a school. A place for young engineers to learn that ethics are as important as equations. We want to teach them about the human variable in the entropy equation. Julian pulled out a chalkboard and began to sketch the relationship between information and entropy, specifically the Landorus principle. Every bit of information we hide from the world increases the total entropy, the chaos of the system. Julian explained. By being honest, we've actually lowered the heat of the city's future. The reunion was bittersweet. They talked about Marcus and the years lost to the shadows. Aries showed them a small prototype of a safe home battery, no larger than a showbox, which was already powering the cabin's lights. It hummed with a soft, comforting frequency. You're the one who kept the blue bag, Julian said, looking at Sarah. We want you to keep the watch, too, and the suitcase. They belong to you now. You're the curator of the Trinity's history. I'm just a girl who wanted a hotel room, Sarah said, smiling. No. Julian corrected. You're the person who didn't look away. That's the most important role in any system. As the sun set over the lake, casting a golden path across the water, Sarah felt a sense of completion. The data was safe, the men were free, and the truth was a permanent part of the world's record. But as she tucked the gold watch back into her pocket, the dial felt slightly warm. She frowned. The Trinity was supposed to be inactive. The warmth in the gold watch persisted even after Sarah returned to the city. It wasn't a thermal runaway heat. It was a rhythmic, pulsing warmth, like a heartbeat. Sarah spent hours in her new, safe apartment, provided by the Witness Protection Program, studying the blue silk of the original suitcase. She began to wonder if Julian and Aries knew everything. They were the engineers, but Arthur Vance was the maker. She remembered Julian's words. He made 3 of them. But why 3? Why blue, crimson, and yellow? In the world of light, those are the primary colors. But in the world of pigment, they are the base from which all other colors are born. If you mix them all, you get black. If you subtract them all, you get white. Sarah took a magnifying glass to the blue silk lining. She found a microscopic sequence of numbers stitched into the seam near the bottom corner. It wasn't a coordinate or a code. It was a frequency. 440.00 Hz. The tuning note, Sarah whispered. She realized that the Trinity wasn't the end of Arthur Vance's work. The 3 bags were components, yes, but they were also a search party. She went to the city archives and searched for the name Arthur Vance. She found a death certificate from 10 years ago, but the address listed was a small shop in the old quarter that was still paying its taxes. She didn't tell Mark. She didn't tell the police. She took the blue suitcase and walked to the old quarter. The shop was a narrow building squeezed between a bakery and a clockmaker. The sign above the door was faded, but the symbol was unmistakable. The same bird carved into the gold watch. The door was unlocked. Inside, the shop was a cathedral of leather, silk, and brass. Thousands of suitcases lined the walls, but none of them were blue, crimson, or yellow. They were all a deep, dark brown. An old man sat at a workbench, his back to her. He was stitching a piece of leather with a steady, rhythmic motion. "I wondered if the blue one would find its way back first," he said. His voice was like dry parchment. "You're Arthur Vance," Sarah said. "I am the man who made the containers," he replied, turning around. He had the same kind, sharp eyes as the photo of Julian's brothers. "The engineers built the fire, Sarah. I just built the hearths to keep it from burning the house down. But there is a 4th hearth." Sarah felt the watch in her pocket pulse. A 4th bag. Arthur Vance stood up, his joints creaking. He walked to a shelf at the very back of the shop, hidden behind a heavy velvet curtain. He pulled out a small, square case. It was made of a material Sarah had never seen. Neither leather nor metal, but a shimmering, translucent white. "This is the opal bag," Arthur said. "The engineers didn't know about this one. Julian, Marcus, and Aries were brilliant, but they were men of science. They believed that if you solve the math, you solve the problem. They forgot about the soul." He placed the opal case on the counter. The blue, crimson, and yellow bags held the parts of the machine. But the opal bag holds the off switch. It's a dampening field. If the technology ever becomes a weapon, if it's ever used to hurt people instead of help them, this case can nullify any Thornvane reaction within a 10-mile radius. Sarah looked at the white case. It was beautiful and terrifying. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because the collector wasn't working for Nova Energy," Arthur said, his voice dropping. "He was working for a group that wants the world to stay exactly as it is. They don't want clean energy. They want control. And now that the technology is open source, they're going to use the opal bag to shut down any city that doesn't follow their rules." Sarah realized the trap. The victory at the rail terminal had released the energy, but it had also created a world that was now dependent on a technology that could be silenced by a single white suitcase. "The collector is out," Arthur said. "The Phase 2 he mentioned. It wasn't about the files. It was about this." Suddenly, the shop window shattered. A black-clad figure swung through the glass. Not the collector, but a team of professionals in tactical gear. They didn't aim for Sarah, they aimed for the opal bag. "Run, Sarah!" Arthur yelled, throwing a heavy jar of leather oil at the first intruder. Sarah grabbed the opal case. It was incredibly light, almost weightless. She didn't have time to think. She burst through the back door and into the alleyway. The gold watch was no longer pulsing. It was screaming, a high-pitched tone that only she could hear. She was back in the rain, back in the shadows. But this time, she wasn't just carrying a secret. She was carrying the balance of power for the entire world. The chase through the old quarter was a blur of wet cobblestones and narrow passages. Sarah's lungs burned, but the opal case felt like it was pulling her forward, leading her toward the high ground of the city. She realized the high-pitched tone from the watch was a proximity alert. He was close. She reached the top of the clock tower overlooking the central plaza. The rain was heavy now, a freezing downpour that blurred the city lights into smears of neon. She turned around to see the collector standing at the top of the stairs. He looked different, calmer, and he was holding a device that looked like a specialized receiver. "Give it to me, Sarah," the collector said. "The world isn't ready for a fourth bag. If you keep it, the chaos Julian started will never end. This bag is the only thing that can keep the peace." "Whose peace?" Sarah asked, her back to the ledge. "A peace where you decide who gets power and who stays in the dark." "It's called balance," the collector replied. "The Thornvein technology is too powerful. It's an entropy accelerator. If everyone has a sun in their pocket, the world will burn. The opal bag is the regulator." Sarah looked down at the opal case. She saw the maker's mark on the latch, a small bird with its wings spread wide. She realized that Arthur Vance hadn't made the fourth bag to be a weapon of control. He had made it to be a final safeguard, a gift for someone who knew the value of the light. She remembered the formula for the dampening field Julian had whispered once in the mine. It was a Fourier transform of the stability wave. By releasing the dampening field, she wouldn't just stop the batteries. She would neutralize the threat of the collector's control. "You're right," Sarah said, her voice rising above the wind. "The world isn't ready. But it's not ready for you either." She didn't hand him the bag. She didn't throw it. She opened it. A wave of pure, silent energy rippled out from the tower. It wasn't a light, but a sudden, profound stillness. Below them, in the plaza, the glowing Thornvein displays flickered and dimmed to a safe, manageable glow. The collector's receiver sparked and died. His tactical team's communication headsets hissed with static. The opal bag didn't destroy the technology. It calibrated it. It set a global limit that made it impossible for the cells to ever reach the flashpoint of a thermal runaway. It turned a dangerous miracle into a safe utility. The collector fell to his knees, staring at the empty white case. His balance was gone. The power was no longer a lever he could pull. "It's over," Sarah said. She walked past him, down the stairs, and into the night. She left the opal bag on the floor of the clock tower. It had done its job. 1 year later, the Hotel Blue had been renovated. It was no longer a place of shadows and creaking floorboards, but a bright, modern boutique hotel powered entirely by the Millervane grid. The manager, a new one, a woman with a kind smile, checked Sarah in with a polite nod. Sarah carried a single suitcase. It wasn't blue, crimson, yellow, or white. It was a simple, sturdy brown leather bag she had bought herself. She was no longer a witness, a curator, or a fugitive. She was just Sarah Miller, an architect. She walked to the window of room 402 and looked out at the city. The skyline was dotted with the soft, steady glow of the new energy. There were no more great transmissions, no more corporate wars. The world had adjusted to its new light. She pulled the gold watch from her pocket. It was silent now. The hands moved with the perfect, quiet precision of a well-balanced life. She placed it on the bedside table. Mark was waiting for her downstairs. They were going to a celebration at the Vainthorn Academy. Julian and Ares were unveiling a statue to Marcus, and they wanted Sarah to give the opening speech. Sarah took one last look around the room. She remembered the girl who had hidden under this bed, clutching a blue suitcase she didn't understand. She felt a surge of empathy for that girl, but she didn't miss her. She picked up her bag and walked toward the door. As she reached for the light switch, she noticed a small, blue silk ribbon tied to the handle of the door. She smiled. "Every story needs a beginning," she whispered. "But the best ones know when to let go." She turned off the light. The room didn't go dark. It stayed bathed in the gentle, stable glow of the city outside. Sarah Miller walked out of the room, closed the door, and stepped into the future.